start with the ages of Middle-earth that we know about. The first age of Middle-earth is familiar to many Tolkien readers, as that's where much of the action of the Silmarillion takes place, and ends with the War of Roth and the sinking of much of Western Middle-earth. The Second Age covers the rise of Sauron, the forging of the Rings of Power, the rise and fall of Númenor. That ended with Sauron's downfall and the loss of the One Ring. It's what we saw in the introductory flashback to the Lord of the Rings films. The Third Age is the one we're most familiar with. It runs for just over 3,000 years, and at the end of it we get our stories from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The Fourth Age is what happens after that, and we get some details about the early years. Tolkien tells us about what happens to the heroes of The Lord of the Rings, the Hobbits, Legolas and Gimli, Aragorn and Arwen, Faramir and Éowyn, and so on, and the headlines of Aragorn's long reign over the reunited kingdom. Some magical people and things clearly survived on to the Fourth Age. Tom Bombadil remained in the Old Forest. Radagast was somewhere. 2 of the 7 Palantiri Seeing Stones survived. And though the Rings of Power lost their virtues with the destruction of the One Ring, nevertheless there were many more lesser magical rings, as well as magical swords and the like, lying around or in use. But by and large, the magical and mythological elements of the world slowly disappeared. The elves all sailed west or diminished and faded. The dwarves reclaimed Khazad-dûm, then got back to mining and ignoring the outside world. Ents grew tired and indistinguishable from the trees they shepherded. Orcs were destroyed and the dragons dwindled. The dominion of man took over Middle-earth. And I suppose most of us assumed that that's where the story ends. The Fourth Age just dragged on for a while and we don't know what happened next. But that's not what Tolkien wanted, because Tolkien saw Middle-earth as our Earth. He was very clear that it wasn't just a matter of being in a different moment in time, but also a different moment in imagination. But that isn't to say that they are different places. Middle-earth is our Earth. Indeed, if you read deeper into Tolkien's legendarium, and even in his letters back to fans, you can see that he kept up the writing conceit that he was, in-world, someone who has come into the possession of some ancient manuscripts and was translating and presenting those stories for us. At an even more grounded level, in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, he describes hobbits as not just fictional creations or people from a long-lost age, but still here now, in our age. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favourite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than forge bellows, a watermill or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. So Middle-earth is our Earth, and hobbits are still among us, though they hide from us so we can't see them. But what about those ages? How do we get from the Fourth Age to where we are today? And what's this about a Seventh Age? Well, let's start with the 1958 letter he wrote to Rona Beer, a fellow writer and scholar. He said, "I imagine the gap between the fall of Barad-dûr and our days to be about 6,000 years. That is, we are now at the end of the Fifth Age, if the ages were about the same length as the Second and Third. But they have, I think, quickened, and I imagine that we are now actually at the end of the Sixth Age, or in the Seventh." Tolkien evidently began thinking more deeply on the subject after that, and 2 years later modified his view, writing that we were then living in the year 1960 of the Seventh Age. So the Seventh Age is our age, and intriguingly matches up with the Western calendar. Year Zero, or the changeover from the Sixth Age to the Seventh Age, happened with the birth of Christ. This, of course, makes sense. Tolkien was a very strong Catholic Christian. Of course, his understanding of the world now, even through the lens of his sub-created world, was a Catholic Christian one. As was, it would seem, the very concept of enumerated ages of the world. In The Nature of Middle-earth, an excellent bit of Tolkien scholarship, by the way, and well worth a read, editor Carl F. Hostetter explains that While many are familiar with the concept of named ages of the world as found in classical mythology, e.g. the Golden Age, the Silver Age, etc., it is far less known that the Catholic Church has long espoused a system of numbered ages of the world, extending through at least a sixth age. Throughout Tolkien's life, the proclamation of the birth of Christ, just before the start of the Christmas Vigil Mass, flatly stated that Christ was born in the sixth age of the world. This is something Tolkien will have been very aware of. These six ages were first propounded by Augustine, with the Venerable Bede later positing a seventh age concurrent with the sixth. Per Augustine's original formulation, the epochal events ending each of the first four ages were the Deluge, Noah's flood, the calling of Abraham, the crowning of King David, and the Jewish people's captivity in Babylon, respectively. Clearly, these moments are irreconcilable with Tolkien's first four ages, but perhaps what we see here are some hints as to what might have been events that marked the dividing lines between the end of the fourth and the start of the fifth, or the end of the fifth and the start of the sixth in Tolkien's world. Tolkien doesn't tell us. In fact, we don't have anything to go on, really, for the fifth and sixth ages. We could speculate that if we're looking for an event that can bridge between the mythological events of the first four ages and the real-life events of more recent ages, perhaps the Flood is a good guess, a story told by many cultures and with many similarities and clearly calamitous on whatever scale it actually took place on, and the kind of thing that could wash away the remains of the Fourth Age, but that would just be speculation. What Tolkien does talk about, to a surprising degree in his wider writings about Middle-earth, is the event which ended the Sixth Age and ushered in the Seventh, the One himself entering into Arda. One need not share the same religion as Tolkien to understand that his particular perspective of the primary world unquestionably informed the shaping of his secondary world in this regard. Having the dates of the Seventh Age coterminous with the Anno Domini dating system is a dead giveaway, but even more telling is what's written in The Debate of Finrod and Andreth, which Tolkien intended as the final appendix to what later became the Silmarillion. In it, the high elf Finrod Felagund, yes, that's Galadriel's brother, and the human wise woman Andreth debate the nature of mortality. Towards the end, Andreth reveals to Finrod the prophecy of the Old Hope. They say that the One will himself enter into Arda and heal men and all the marring from the beginning of the earth. This, they also say, or they feign, is a rumour that has come down through years uncounted, even from the days of our undoing. Finrod saw that such would necessitate that the divine nature be something akin to the Christian conception of the Trinity, for as it seems to me, he said, even if he in himself were to enter in, he must also remain as he is, the author without. Tolkien then explained in the endnotes, since Finrod had already guessed that the redemptive function was originally specially assigned to men, he probably proceeded to the expectation that the coming of Eru, if it took place, would be specially and primarily concerned with men. That is, to an imaginative guess or vision that Eru would come in incarnate human form. And to dispel any conjecture that this prophecy would find its fulfillment only in a purely fictional parallel of the historical incarnation, Christopher Tolkien commented, "But this surely is not parody, nor even parallel, but the extension, if only represented as vision, hope, or prophecy, of the theology of Arda into specifically, and of course centrally, Christian belief." Again, regardless of any reader's religious opinions regarding the real world, it is clear that Tolkien's authorial intent for his secondary world was for the incarnation of Christ in human theology, God becoming a human and living among us for a time, to be understood as the entering of Eru Ilúvatar, the one true God of his legendarium, into Arda. Jesus was Eru Ilúvatar as a human, walking among us. At which point, we should probably pause again for a moment and remind ourselves that yes, this is the same Tolkien who disliked allegory in all its forms. This is surely why you have to dig into the weeds of Tolkien's wider writings to tease out this overtly theological bit of world building. This is not Narnia with its straightforward Christian allegories. The stories we read are not Christian allegories, they are intended for everyone. But Tolkien's faith was so deep that at its heart it echoed his view of our own world. And when the two worlds met, they fitted Christian theology. But besides theology, why is all this important? Why did Tolkien so clearly want his legendarium to be not just abstract stories in a world like ours, but our own world in a different age? I think the answer lies with something Sam Gamgee says upon the stairs of Cirith Ungol as the hobbits are about to finally enter Mordor. The greatest dangers and darkest moments were at hand. He recalled the story of the Silmarils back in the First Age, and Beron's dark path in recovering one, and how he passed it to his heir Eärendil, and how it was the light from Eärendil's star, the same Silmaril, that reflected in Galadriel's mirror. He suddenly exclaims, "And why, sir, I've never thought of that before. You've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales ever end?" That light can be traced back even further to the two trees of Valinor, and further forward to the evening star Venus in our own night sky. Tolkien wants us to see that these aren't just far-off stories to warm our hearts. They are a part of us. By making us be in the 7th Age of Middle-earth, not just our own 21st century, he wants us to see that we ourselves are part of the same story as Sam and Frodo before us, and Bilbo before them, and Beren and Luthien millennia before that. We too are part of the great tale that never ends. If you want more deep dives into the lore of Tolkien's Legendarium, please click on the link to the playlist that's on the left of your screen now. Or to support this channel, the best way to do that is through Patreon. The link is on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.
Vengeance is yours.
What happened after The Lord of the Rings? Once Aragorn is king and the ring-bearers have sailed west, what did Tolkien actually tell us about the 4th Age of Middle-earth? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we cover Tolkien's Legendarium in depth, as well as other great fantasy worlds like A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher. Welcome. The 4th Age of Middle-earth starts with the fall of Sauron and the destruction of the One Ring, basically when the main story of The Lord of the Rings ends. And everything has changed. Sauron's empire falls, Aragorn is king, Elrond, Galadriel and Gandalf leave Middle-earth, the aging leaders of the Last Age, Theoden, Denethor, Dain, are dead. It's a new start of sorts. So what did happen after The Lord of the Rings? Let's start with the hobbits. After the scouring of the Shire, Sam married Rosie, and they had 13 children all told. Eleanor, Frodo, Rose, Merry, Pippin, Goldilocks, Hamfast, Daisy, Primrose, Bilbo, Ruby, Robin and Tolman. After Frodo sailed from the Grey Havens, Sam and his family moved into Bag End. He also inherited the Red Book of Westmarch, in which the Legendarium of Middle-earth and the stories of the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings were first preserved. After he also left for the Undying Lands, he passed it on to his daughter Eleanor, and it was then passed down generation to generation, which is how we eventually got the story. Although I'm sure he remained humble to the last, Sam became a rather important person in the Shire. He replanted the Shire after the devastation of Sharky's reign with the soil given him by Galadriel. Where the party tree had been, he planted the silver nut, which grew into a huge Malorn tree. In recognition of this, he was given the honorific name Gardener, by which his descendants were known throughout the ages. And Sam himself became Mayor of the Shire, elected for 7 successive 7-year terms. When his beloved wife Rosie died, he was still full of life. He had been a ring-bearer too, remember, but wearied of life without her and his beloved Mr. Frodo. He sailed to the Undying Lands himself at the age of 102 to be reunited with Frodo there. After Merry's decisive involvement in the uprising against Sharky and the ruffians, He, rather wonderfully, became known as Merry the Magnificent, and like Sam, quickly took up a position of responsibility among the hobbits, becoming Master of Buckland. He married and also added quite a lot to the Red Book, with tomes on herblore, language and history. After Frodo and Sam had both sailed from the Grey Havens, however, and his wife had died, he quit the Shire with Pippin to head to Rohan. Pippin himself had become Thane of the Shire, basically head of their military, such as it was, and collected a library of historical information on the wider world for the benefit of the Shire. When he and Merry left the Shire, leaving everything to their sons, Pippin was 94. The two of them stayed with King Eomer until he died, then on to Gondor, where they both eventually passed away after long and eventful lives. When Aragorn died, their bodies were buried beside his in perpetuity, a place of great honour. The hobbits more broadly prospered into the Fourth Age as far as we know. Aragorn formally extended the Shire to include Buckland to the east and as far as the Tower Hills to the west, and it's through the Hobbit's Red Book of Westmarch that we know so much of what we know about Middle-earth. I'm sure the march of technology eventually overtook them, but Aragorn guaranteed their protection and independence throughout his reign. The Shire was kept for the hobbits. For the elves, though, the story was very different. Galadriel had predicted as much when Frodo passed through Lothlorien, for with the end of the One Ring, her ring, which had been preserving and protecting Lothlorien all this time, would also lose its power. Elrond's ring too. She said to Frodo, "Do you not see now wherefore your coming is to us as the footsteps of doom? For if you fail, then we are laid bare to the enemy. Yet if you succeed, then our power is diminished, and Lothlorien will fade, and the tides of time will sweep it away. We must depart into the west, or dwindle to a rustic folk of dell and cave, slowly to forget and to be forgotten." That is exactly what happened. Over the course of the next century, most elves, including all those we know by name, took ships and sailed west from the Grey Havens until the last ship, built by Círdan, carried himself and Celeborn and the last of the High Elves into the Undying Lands. By the year 120 of the Fourth Age, Rivendell and Lothlorien had both given themselves over once more to nature. Some elves did choose to stay in Middle-earth, deep in places like the Woodland Realm and to the far east, but they grew scarcer and more secretive than ever, and eventually faded away entirely. The Ents never did find the Entwives, and slowly they too faded, becoming more and more like the trees they shepherded. Other magical beings, like the dragons, seem to also have dwindled with the end of Sauron, diminishing and passing into legend. The orcs were also wiped out. Many of those closest to and under the control of Sauron did not even survive the fall of the Black Tower. As we read in The Return of the King after the ring was destroyed, "So the creatures of Sauron, orc or troll or beast spell-enslaved, ran hither and thither mindless, and some slew themselves, or cast themselves in pits, or fled wailing back to hide in holes and dark, lightless places, far from hope. Those that didn't were rounded up and put to the sword by Aragorn and his generals in the years that followed. Some who were further away and less under Sauron's control did survive for a time, but eventually all of Sauron's dark forces faded and left Middle-earth. With the end of the Balrog and Smaug and the diminishing of the orcs, the dwarves finally had the opportunity to reclaim the lands that were once theirs, and even to expand out into new areas. The colony of Durin's folk that settled in Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, continued to thrive, living in peace and friendship with the humans of Dale and the surrounding areas. Gimli had been based there, but led a group away to the Glittering Caves, those caverns he had discovered behind Helm's Deep. Sometime after the year 171 of the Fourth Age, King Durin VII finally retook Moria, where it is said that his descendants remained until the world grew old and the dwarves failed and the days of Durin's race were ended. So the dwarves stayed in Middle-earth and prospered, and delved deeper and deeper into the earth, mining and crafting and eventually themselves becoming legends. I like that ending for them. Legolas and Gimli, we should say, grew ever closer as friends, and through them the ancient enmity between the races was brought to an end, just as the elves were leaving Middle-earth. As Gimli himself grew old, it is said that he joined Legolas in a final journey westwards, the only dwarf ever to sail to Valinor. His admittance there was, some say, a special dispensation by Galadriel herself for her champion. What was left with all these races diminishing and leaving was humanity, what became known as the Dominion of Man. Aragorn, as we know, was crowned king of the newly reunited kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. He reigned as King Elessar, with Arwen beside him as queen, for 122 years. He achieved a lot in that time. Minas Tirith was rebuilt with the help of Gimli and the dwarves and some elves. He formalised the peace and friendship with Rohan, who were then ruled by Éomer. We've already mentioned how he extended the borders of the Shire and also formalised its status as a free land under the protection of the crown, and forbade big people from entering it. He did something similar with the Druadan Forest, making it a free land, and retitled Faramir the Steward of Gondor, Prince of Ithilien. Any orcs remaining in or on the borders of his realm were ruthlessly hunted down. In short, he took all the steps necessary to secure the prosperous and safe future of the whole realm. He even magnanimously gave Mordor to his defeated foes, including the former slaves of Nirn, now a freed people, who had been forced to work to feed Sauron's forces. We know less about what happened further east into Rhûn and south into Harad, though we can guess. Sauron's influence and that of Morgoth before him, which had lasted millennia, was gone, so slowly the shadow would lift. Not entirely. Tolkien mentions, for example, that the Blue Wizards, who were based in the east, fell and may have founded dark magic cults and traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. And I'm sure there were other dark marks on the land. But there is no reason to believe that in the long run they wouldn't have prospered and developed like Gondor and Rohan. At which point, it's worth taking a moment to note quite how apocalyptic and far-reaching these changes are in the span of just a few years. The leadership of Gondor, Dale, Rohan and Erebor changed. The elves who had been in Middle-earth for millennia left. The dwarves slowly disappeared. Magical beasts were no longer part of the landscape, and Sauron, who had threatened the free peoples of Middle-earth for centuries, was no more. Just as importantly, those who had opposed him for just as long, Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel and so on, were also gone. Everything changed. What was once a rich, magical land with elves, dwarves, dragons, wizards, and every other staple of high fantasy you could imagine, slowly became a land where humans ruled and magic became rarer. The changes at the start of the Fourth Age were massive, but they had also been coming for a long time. The elves had, one by one or in small groups, been leaving the continent for centuries. The dragons had been waning. The Ents had been slowing down. The downfall of Sauron, the war that led to it, and the end of the Age of the Rings just hastened what was already inevitable. Aragorn's reign, which ushered in these changes, was succeeded by his son Eldarion, who in turn ruled for a century. Prophecy suggests that after him, his realm lasted 100 generations until a new age brought in again new things. From that line came the kings of many realms in long days after. Some remnants of the magical history of Middle-earth surely survived in secret for long ages. Radagast, living in nature, the spirits of the elves who stayed in Middle-earth, haunting the forests they loved. The magical heirlooms passed from generation to generation, but eventually they too faded. And after all that, well, we don't know much about what happened after all that. Tolkien did not write any further into the history of Middle-earth, other than talking in passing about the future ages of the world. I did a video on that if you're interested. But we know that he viewed Middle-earth as being this world, our world, but, in his words, in a different stage of imagination. Not a different age or era, Tolkien was very clear on that, but a different stage of imagination. Created mythology, like Midgard in Norse mythology. In fact, Midgard can itself be translated into English as Middle-earth. So after that stage of imagination had gone, perhaps then we come into our own time of myths and legends. Or perhaps it's best not to think of the end of the Fourth Age as linear at all. It just recedes into mist, like the last ship from the Grey Havens, slowly merged into the sunset.
New modules installed.
If you'd like to see more videos on the world of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, there's a link to my playlist on the left of your screen. Or if you'd like to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.
We are ready. The item is
What are the different types of elves? And are there any real big differences between the Noldor and the Teleri, Sindar and Sylvan? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel, we break down the best in fantasy books and TV shows. The Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, The Witcher, and much more. If you like the sound of that, there's a subscribe button in the bottom right of your screen. Although most of the TV and film adaptations of Tolkien's work have tended to present elves as all rather similar, when you dig into Tolkien's deeper legendarium, you will find that there are many, many different types of elves with different names and different backgrounds, strengths and weaknesses, some of which are more obvious than others. In this video, we will break down all of that. But we should probably start by emphasizing what connected them all. Elves and men were created directly by Ilúvatar, the one god of Tolkien's universe, without any demiurgic mediation by the Valar, as was the case with dwarves and Ents, for example, and were known as the children of Ilúvatar. And the elves emerged first, before humans in Middle-earth, and as well as being first, they were different. This is not just in the pointiness of their ears, but rather the different nature of their souls and how those relate to their bodies and the world as a whole, whereas the soul of a man is a visitor upon the earth, leaving it after a brief time. The soul of an elf is tied to Arda, the world, bound to it for as long as the earth endures. In modern parlance, their souls were eternal, which is both why they were all so long-lived and why their natural home, where their souls were drawn to, was the Undying Lands. Middle-earth, with its swift-changing seasons and cycle of life and death, was for the humans. And when the elves first woke up, they were all one people, and the name they had for themselves was Quendi, originally meaning speaker, as when they explored the world a little, they found that they were the only creatures who spoke, although this meaning shifted later to more broadly mean people. According to the Cuivianiana, the elvish fairy tale they told each other about their beginnings, the first generation of elves woke up in a particular order, in three groups basically, and these three groups or clans eventually settled on names for themselves, the Vanyar, Noldor and Lindar, reflecting prominent aspects about each. Vanyar meant fair, primarily in the sense of pale, with the secondary sense of beautiful later arising also. This was in reference to the predominance of golden blonde hair among them. Noldor meant wise or learned. They were sometimes referred to as the Deep Elves. In Tolkien's earlier writings, he called them the Gnomes, and aside from diminutive stature or beards, many of the popular tropes surrounding gnomes in, say, Dungeons & Dragons or Warcraft were applicable to Tolkien's Noldor, particularly their intelligence and accomplishments as artificers. The name Lindar referred to melody, such as music or the motion of waves and water. They allegedly sang before they even spoke, found bathing in a waterfall. At which point, the Valar found all of the elves and basically summoned them westwards. This was far back in time, well before the First Age, and led to the first great break in the elves, because not all of the elves wanted to go west. Why should they? This was their home, and who were the Valar to tell them to leave? Anyway, the great journey westwards is what resulted in the next major division among the elves. About 2/3 elected to follow Orome into the west, while a third refused the summons, including tellingly the entire first generation. Orome had originally referred to all elves as Eldar, the people of the stars, but that name was then applied only to those who had set forth on the great journey with him, regardless of whether they reached their destination or not. Those who had refused were called Avari, the refusers, though they called themselves the Seniors, because among them were all of the 144 first elves. Later, there would be another way of describing these two groups. Those who desired to see the light of Valinor named themselves the Calaquendi, light elves. They coined their opponents, who did not wish to go, the Moriquendi, dark elves. These terms were primarily in reference to actual light and darkness, but from the first, they also carried moral connotations. As far as the Calaquendi were concerned, and let's not forget they wrote most of the histories we've read, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, the Moriquendi were refusing a summons from the Valar. Moreover, we're told that the dark element in their name may have referred to the glooms and the clouds dimming the stars during the War of the Valar and Melkor, so that the term from the beginning had a tinge of scorn, implying that such folk were not averse to the shadows of Melkor upon Middle-earth. The terms Calaquendi and Moriquendi later took on a more strict definition of whether an elf had seen the light of the two trees in Valinor. But even then, the term was not merely descriptive, but sometimes harshly judgmental of someone's character, the equivalent of an ethnic slur. Remember, the light of the two trees was pure and holy light, so having not seen it was, in the eyes of some, a clear indicator of moral character. Hence, calling someone a Moriquendi or dark elf was basically an insult. We see this in the Silmarillion when Caranthir, one of the Noldor elves and a Calaquendi, insults the mighty King Thingol by calling him a dark elf. Let not the sons of Finarfin run hither and thither with their tails to this dark elf in his caves. Ouch. The irony here, of course, is that although Thingol may have ruled over Moriquendi, he himself was actually a Calaquendi. He had seen the light of the two trees. And although Caranthir is a Calaquendi, he isn't exactly the most morally upright character in the story. He acts as if he hadn't seen the light of the two trees. More broadly, though, the term Eldar to refer to a noble elf and dark elf to refer to an elf of less noble temperament have made their way into the wider generic fantasy lexicon. This is their origin, a distinction between those elves who obeyed the injunction to head west to enjoy the light of the two trees of Valinor and those who did not. And if truth be told, it is just as much a bit of elf trash talk as it is a technical definition. At which point the nomenclature starts getting even more nuanced and interwoven, because following the Sundering, the moment back in the mists of time when most elves headed west but some stayed behind, those who stayed, the Avari, the refusers, did not stay still. Many thousands of years passed and new generations were born, and some eventually migrated westwards to the Vales of Anduin, Eredor, and even into Beleriand. The Avari, it should also be noticed, did not think of themselves as inferior to the Eldar in any way. Indeed, they considered the Eldar to be deserters, and only themselves to be the true continuation of the elves. As a result, the tribes that they eventually formed into each seem to have called themselves a name directly derived from the word Quendi, the very first name the elves gave themselves. Hence the tribes of the Kindi, Quind, Quenti, Windan, Kinlai, and Penny. These don't individually play a huge role in Tolkien's world, but you just know how much fun the linguist must have had working through how elves' self-perceptions must have played into their evolution of self-nomenclature. But, as I said, this is when it gets a bit messy, because as the number of elves grew over time, their groupings split and reformed and split again. And what follows can be boiled down to the fact that any given elf can be described as being a part of several different groups, depending on which initial tribe they or their ancestors were in, whether they had personally seen the light of the two trees, which group they were in now, and so on. Let's return to that initial split between those elves who answered the summons to go west and those who didn't. As we've seen, some of those Avari who stayed, or their descendants, did end up going westwards anyway, just because they wanted to, not because they'd been summoned anywhere. And just as some of the Avari went west, so too some of the Eldar turned aside from their summons or turned back. The first of these were from the Teleri, the hindmost,
Your
the name
presence is
given to the
strong.
Lindar who started the great journey, as they were always at the rear of the march. One among them, Lenwë, refused to chance the misty mountains, which at the time were far more formidable. Those who forsook the way westwards to follow him were then called the Nandor, those who go back. They did not return east, however, instead turning south down the Anduin, where some of the Avari
Production
would see.
of the item is complete.
Lenwë's son, Denethor, obviously this is a very different Denethor to the one we know in The Lord of the Rings, much later led another westwards separate migration into Beleriand. They dwelt in Osiriand, the region just west of the Blue Mountains. This region was
The anima
later
are
named
restless.
Lindon, etymologically related to the tribal name Lindar.
Civilian
Following the
structure
death of
complete.
Denethor in the First Battle of Beleriand, the surviving members of this clan became known as the Laiquendi, the Green Elves, after their camouflaged clothing that blended in with the woodlands of Osiriand.
Your
The
presence
next
is
division
strong.
came at the end of that great march west. The Teleri were still losing people at the back of the column, so to speak, but the Vanyar and Noldor came to the shores of the sea. Then Ulmo brought the Vanyar and Noldor over the sea to a man on a moving island, for want of a better phrase. The Teleri then lost their leader, who became known as Thingol, who became enchanted by the magic and beauty of Melian the Maya, becoming lost in her eyes for literally
Vengeance
years.
is a cruel
Their
mistress.
king missing,
We have
some of the
cleansed the
Teleri,
land
having
of
reached
heathens.
the shore,
It
elected
made
to
a
stay
wise
behind in search for him. But others crowned his brother Olwe and went on anyway to wait upon the shores for
We
Ulmo to
await
return.
your command.
While there, Osser the Maya convinced some of them to stay on the beaches of Beleriand rather than to cross to Aman, and
Production
they
of the
also
item
remained
is
behind when
complete.
Ulmo came to ferry the
Your
Teleri.
presence
So
is
the
strong.
Teleri were basically all over the place, and each of their small subgroups then gained a different name.
Exotics have been
Those
unveiled
Eldar
by
who
our
did make it
scholars.
all the way over to Aman despite the setback were called
Our
the
will
Amanyar,
is
those of Aman.
transcendent.
This included all of the
Hostility
Vanyar and the
research
Noldor
complete.
as well as the Falmari, the Sea Elves. The Sea Elves are basically the Teleri who did make it, and when they got there they decided they actually didn't want to go onto the mainland after all that. They liked the sea too much. Those Eldar who set off on the Great Migration westwards but didn't
Private
make it all the
item
way
ready.
were then called the Umanyar, those not of Aman. This included Teleri, the Nandor,
completion of
those
this
who
item
turned
makes
back,
us
and
stronger.
Sindar. Sindar was a name given to them millennia later, before which they had no need for a word differentiating themselves from others, being the only ones in their part of Beleriand for a long time. They did, however, distinguish between the peoples living in different
research
regions of
complete.
Beleriand. The Lathrim, people of the fence, were
Another
those
planet
dwelling in
joins the
Doriath,
unity.
the land of the fence.
The
They
unity
originally had been
commands
those
your
who lingered to look
destruction.
for their king when he fell under the spell of Melian
Defensive
Maya,
complete.
which meant that they literally missed the boat to a man, so they called themselves the
Production
Eglath,
of
the
item
Forsaken
is
people.
complete.
Those whom Osser had convinced to stay behind because they dwelt in Falas were named the Falathrim. They longed for a man, but loved the shores and coasts of Middle-earth too much.
Insufficient
Chief
man.
among them that we know is Círdan, the shipwright. Those who migrated beyond Beleriand to a region of cooler climate and greyer skies and the mists of the north, cladding themselves in grey to blend into such surroundings, were called the Mithrim, the Grey folk. These were the first elves whom the exiles came across when they returned to Beleriand, and it was probably because of them that the
The item
Noldor
is
began
complete.
referring to all of its inhabitants as Sindar, Grey Elves. The name stuck for two reasons. All of the Sindar acknowledged the overlordship of Thingol, which means grey mantle. These elves in western Middle-earth were also grey in that they stood in the middle between the light elves, the Eldar, and the dark elves, both geographically and spiritually. Though they had not seen the light of a man like their kin to the west,
Our fleet is
neither were
trapped
they
after arriving
completely
at a phase
ignorant of
jumping
it, thanks
inhibitor.
to Melian dwelling among them and Thingol ruling them. They and their ancestors had set off westwards, but for various reasons, noble and ignoble, they had not made it all the way. Because of this, men classified the Sindar as
Upgrade
middle
complete.
elves, not noble high
vengeance
Eldar,
is
but also
yours.
not dark
Hostility
elves.
research
We know
complete.
a lot of the Sindar in The Lord of the Rings, Thranduil and his son Legolas, as well as
research
Celeborn the
complete.
Sindar. Things stayed roughly that way for a while, But the next divisions came after the flight of the Noldor from the Undying Lands. Most, but not all, of the Noldor headed back to Middle-earth, following Feanor's lead. They sometimes called themselves the Exiled Noldor, which is a bit of a stretch, as it was very much a self-imposed exile, but more often simply the Noldor, since they represented the majority of the tribe. New elf kinds began to arise at this time as the different kinds of elves then mixed. Eldar returning from the west, the Sindar in the middle who had set off for the west but not made it, and even sometimes the occasional Avari, dark elf, who had not set off at all but ended up heading westwards anyway. An example here are the Gondolindrim, the people of the hidden realm of Gondolin, who were a mixture of Sindar and Noldor. This was a common occurrence throughout the First Age and later, as the previous trend of elves breaking up into increasingly smaller divisions reversed, with many mixing together to create new peoples. This was accelerated following the sinking of Beleriand at the end of the First Age. Many surviving elves migrated east, mingling with the previous inhabitants there to form new peoples. Though the original inhabitants of the Lindon were called the Lyquendi, a majority of Noldor and some Sindar settled around the newly formed Gulf of Lune. These included Círdan, a Faladhrim, Celeborn, a Lathrim, his wife Galadriel, a Noldor, their High King Gil-galad, Elrond Half-Elven, and all the peoples belonging to those lords. Many then went back further east again, merging with those Nandor who had settled in the Vales of the Anduin as the Sylvan Elves, or Wood Elves, already among whom there were also some Avari. As such, this was something of a long-lost family reunion, with the Sindar, Nandor, Lyquendi, and those Avari all descending from the Lindar. From this came two elven peoples that we know, the Galadhrim and the Elves of Mirkwood. Taking the Mirkwood elves first, in addition to the Lyquendi, Oropher, the father of Thranduil and grandfather of Legolas, brought a handful of Sindar with him to Mirkwood, with the Sylvan elves there taking him as their king. The Sindar, in return, became entirely assimilated into the Sylvan people, adopting their culture and language wholesale. This is why Legolas sometimes refers to himself as a Sindar elf and sometimes as a Sylvan elf. He's also a wood elf and a grey elf, a Moriquendi but not an Avari, even though some Avari are now elves of Mirkwood like him. You can say something similar about the Sylvan elves living on the eastern side of the Anduin in Lothlorien, who are known as the Galadhrim, tree people. In the Second and Third Ages, Noldor and Sindar migrated through Moria to mingle with the Galadhrim, whose culture began to be influenced by the newcomers. Like their kin in Mirkwood, they took for their king a Sindar elf, Amdir, and after his son Amroth was lost, rule of the Galadhrim was taken up by Galadriel and Celeborn, a Noldor and a Sindar. Following the fall of Eregion, many more Noldor fled through Moria to Lorien, further changing the demographic composition of the Galadhrim. Yes, there are lots of different names for the different kinds of elves, but the crucial point here is that in the end, it didn't matter. They all came back together in places like Mirkwood and Lothlorien and just became elves, Quendi, once more. This echoes, consciously or unconsciously, what Tolkien was trying to do at a meta level in creating a mythology for England. The idea of the three original tribes called to cross the water westwards, a motif repeated with the three houses of men and the three clans of hobbits, mythically foreshadowed the three tribes of Angles, Saxons and Jutes who migrated from the continent westwards across the North Sea to Britain in real-world British history. With the light and dark elves, Tolkien borrowed elements from other northern mythologies that the early Anglo-Saxons might have had as part of their own. With those dwelling across enchanted seas, within elusive forests and in caves beneath the earth, we see something of the fairies found in the Celtic otherworld, albeit the true tradition of the fairies, of which the Irish and the Welsh tell only garbled things, as Tolkien phrased it in an early version of his Legendarium. In our real-world Britain, the tribes multiplied and migrations continued. Norse, Norman, and so on into our present time until modern Britain was formed, where ethnicities and legends and histories blurred, formed and reformed. Tolkien's Elves of Middle-earth echo that crucible. That's why it feels so real, because messiness and complexities such as that Tolkien created with his elves are part of personal identity, a reflection of where we come from and where we stand now. If you'd like more videos about Tolkien's amazing world, please click on the link on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, the best way to do that is by clicking on the link to Patreon on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.
Vengeance is a cruel mistress. Harmony research complete.
They are among the most fierce and dangerous creatures ever devised by the Dark Lord Morgoth.
Commerce upgrade
While the
complete.
most famous of their kind would appear in Bilbo's Third Age adventure, the greatest and most vile would live and die far earlier. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the dragons of Middle-earth. We don't know the exact year Morgoth began creating the dragons, but we do know the reason. In the early wars of the First Age, the Noldor dealt great blows against the Dark Lord in war. In the midst of a 400-year siege of Angband, where the Noldor held Morgoth in check within his fortress, he realized orcs alone would not win him victory in battle. Thus, Morgoth creates the very first dragon, Glaurung. The father of dragons was not a winged creature like his later relatives. In fact, all the initial dragons of Morgoth's design were landbound. In 260 of the First Age, in the middle of the siege, Glaurung reveals himself for the first time, against the wishes of his master. He emerges from Angband and manages a small victory, despite still being young and not yet grown to full strength. He pushes the Noldor from Ardgallen and causes them to retreat to Dorthonion and the arid Wethrin. He begins to defile Ardgallen in his victory, but it would not last. Fingon, along with a company of mounted archers, comes to Glaurung and humbles the Great Worm, causing him to retreat back to Angband. Morgoth is displeased that his secret weapon had revealed himself prematurely, and would not allow the dragon to leave the fortress for nearly 200 years. Finally, in 455, Glaurung is fully grown, and is unleashed upon the elves. Glaurung leads Morgoth's largest army of Balrogs and orcs assembled to date, utterly burning the lands of Ardgallen, creating a charred desert known afterward as Anfaugli. 17 years later, the Free Peoples would strike back against Morgoth. The Union of Maethros, consisting of armies in both the east and the west, marches against Angband. On the third morning of this battle, Glaurung and his dragons enter the fight, in Morgoth's last effort to defeat his enemies. The strength and terror of the Great Worm were now great indeed, and elves and men withered before him, and he came between the hosts of Maethros and Fingon, and swept them apart. The elves divided, Glaurung battles in the eastern portion of the conflict, where he would have destroyed the Noldor, were it not for the dwarves of Belegost, led by Lord Azaghal. The dwarves, with their great battle masks, were able to withstand the dragon fire, and Glaurung's skin was not so tough that it was impenetrable. The dwarves hewed at the dragon with their axes, and Glaurung, driven into a rage, tramples Azaghal. Yet, with his last breath, Azaghal drives a knife into the belly of the dragon. Glaurung flees from the battle, yet the battle was already won. The forces of elves, men, and dwarves would have catastrophic casualties in what would come to be known as the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. It wouldn't be until 40 years later that Glaurung would once again be put to use by Morgoth. By 495, Morgoth controls nearly the entire north of Beleriand, and there are few who openly oppose him. One such realm is Nargothrond, where King Orodreth is convinced to act in open hostility by his advisor, Turin, son of Hurin. Finally, after a number of attacks on his forces, Morgoth sends Glaurung and an army of orcs to Nargothrond. In another ill-advised move, Turin and Orodreth ride out to meet their enemy in the Battle of Tumhalad. The elves are crushed, Orodreth is slain, and Turin is unable to reach the city before the Great Dragon. Glaurung passes over the bridge, crosses the river Narog, and destroys the doors of the city. In this moment, we learn of another power of Glaurung, the power of his words and his gaze. Turin arrives at Nargothrond to find the city sacked, and as he goes to confront the dragon, he is transfixed by Glaurung's gaze, which freezes him where he stands. The captives of Nargothrond are led past Turin, and the dragon presents him with a choice: to pursue the captives and rescue the elf princess Finduilas, or return to Dor-lómin and rescue his mother and sister, who are living in misery and servitude. Then suddenly Glaurung withdrew his glance and waited, and Turin stirred slowly as one waking from a hideous dream. Then coming to himself with a loud cry, he sprang upon the dragon, but Glaurung laughed, saying,
"If you wish to be slain, I will slay you gladly. But small help will that be to Morwen and Nienor. No heed did you give to the cries of the elf woman. Will you deny also the bond of your blood?"
Turin, drawing back his sword, stabbed at his eyes, and Glaurung, coiling back, swiftly towered above him and said,
"Nay, at least you are valiant, beyond all whom I have met. And they lie who say that we of our part do not honor the valor of foes. See now, I offer you freedom. Go to your kin if you can. Get you gone. And if elf or man be left to make tale of these days, then surely in scorn they will name you, if you spurn this gift."
Then Turin, being yet bemused by the eyes of the dragon, as if he were treating with a foe that could know pity, believed the words of Glaurung, and turning away he sped over the bridge. But as he went, Glaurung spoke behind him, saying in a fell voice,
"Haste you now, son of Hurin, to Dor-lómin, or perhaps the orcs shall come before you once again. And if you tarry for Finduilas, then never shall you see Morwen or Nienor again, and they will curse you."
As Turin turns north to Dor-lómin, the dragon laughs once again in his malice. For Turin has fallen for the dragon's lie. For his mother and sister had left long ago, and now dwell safely in Doriath. Glaurung drives away the orcs, denying them further plunder, and breaks the bridge. He lies down to sleep on his great hoard, in much the same way as his later descendants. The following year, Glaurung encounters Morwen and Nienor as they come to Nargothrond seeking news of Turin. Quickly detecting their approach, he lies in the river, causing a great steam and stench to cover the area. The women and their elf guard are separated, and Nienor comes face to face with the dragon, who also puts her under his spell. In this case, however, Glaurung uses his power to wipe Nienor's mind of all her memory, leaving her to flee into the wild. As Glaurung returns to his conquered city, he detects the presence of Mablung, one of the elves accompanying Nienor and Morwen. In this moment, we realize there is a deep connection between dragon and master, as he speaks with the very voice of Morgoth. But he turned before he went in and looked back eastward, and there came from him the laughter of Morgoth, dim but horrible, as an echo of malice out of the black depths far away. And this voice, cold and low, came after. "There you lie like a vole under the bank, Mablung the Mighty.
Ill do you run the errands of Thingol. Haste you now to the hill, and see what is become of your charge.
Glaurung would rule Nargothrond as a dragon king for the next few years. By 498, he begins to send parties of orcs to attack the mannish realm of Brethil, which forces Turin to reveal himself once more. The following year, Glaurung sets out to face his mighty foe himself. However, Turin predicts the dragon's path, and taking inspiration from Lord Azaghal before him, Turin hides out in the gorge of Kabed and Aras. So as the great serpent casts his front legs across the ravine, Turin stabs him with his sword, Gurthang, all the way to the hilt. Even in his final moments, Glaurung is dangerous and cunning. As Turin pulls the sword from the dragon, its blood covers his arm and renders Turin unconscious. Later, Turin's wife, Niniel, comes upon the scene to discover her husband apparently dead. With his last breath, Glaurung reveals his ultimate deception, that Niniel is in fact Turin's sister Nienor, and gives her back her memory. In despair at the truth and the loss of her twice-beloved Turin, Nienor casts herself from the brink and is lost to the river far below. Turin, waking at the death of the dragon, discovers the truth for himself from another who had heard Glaurung's last words, and casts himself upon his own sword. With Glaurung dead, Morgoth had suffered a great loss. However, his first dragon would not be his greatest. Other dragons, known as Glaurung's brood, either by parentage or simply others of the same species, would wreak havoc in further wars and battles. Just 11 years after Glaurung's death, Morgoth would launch an attack on the last great hope of the Noldor, for he had finally discovered the location of the hidden city of Gondolin. He sends an army of orcs, balrogs, and dragons, and catches the elves by surprise. The city and much of its population is destroyed. While we don't know how many dragons there were, we are told they were many and terrible. Aside from Glaurung, we know the names of only 2 other dragons of the First Age. One is Gostir, of whom we only know its name, which means Dreadglance. The other would not be revealed until the War of Wrath, which begins in the year 545. Finally deciding to move against Morgoth, the Valar send the host of Valinor to Middle-earth, where a massive force of elves, men, Maiar, and possibly even some Valar make war upon an uncountable force of orcs, along with the Balrogs of Morgoth. This war would last for 40 years. In the final years of the conflict, facing the defeat of his forces, Morgoth unleashes his last and greatest weapon, the winged dragons, never before seen in Middle-earth. The host of Valinor is caught by surprise, overwhelmed by the sheer devastation of the flying fire drakes of Angband. The dragons are led by Ancalagon the Black, the largest and most powerful dragon in the history of the world. The skies erupt with lightning and flame as the dragons push back the army of Valinor. Just as it appears that Ancalagon and his winged dragons will bring ultimate victory to Morgoth, help comes from the skies. Erendil, the father of Elrond and Elros, arrives in his ship, blessed with the power of flight by the Valar. Alongside him are the great eagles of the First Age, led by Thorondor. The aerial battle lasts for an entire day. In the end, Erendil slew Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host, and cast him from the sky. And he fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, and they were broken in his ruin. Thus ended the greatest of the flying dragons, and with him the hope of Morgoth's victory. The host of Valinor retakes their lost ground and more, destroying the majority of Morgoth's army. The Dark Lord would be captured and thrust through the Door of Night, and the few remnants of his army were scattered, including orcs, Sauron, a lone Balrog,
Defilers encroach upon
and
us.
some dragons. The dragons would flee to the northern waste,
Whatever the unity
far from any
wills.
lands of men and elves. There they would live on, infesting and breeding in the area known as the Withered Heath, from which would come future great dragons that would plague the dwarves of the Third Age. Dragons like Smaug. As for the Second Age, we are given no specific events or battles involving the dragons. However, we do know that they posed a serious threat during this period of over 3,400 years. For in the Silmarillion, we read of the men who were not among the Edain of the First Age, and men dwelt in darkness, and they were troubled by many evil things that Morgoth had devised in the days of his dominion. Demons, and dragons, and misshapen beasts, and the unclean orcs that are mockeries of the children of Iluvatar. And the lot of men was unhappy. But it was not only the men that would be plagued by these foul creatures of Morgoth, for in the Third Age we would see the dwarves repeatedly become victims of the Urulokki, or fire drakes, as well as the cold drakes of the north.
While we know Smaug would sack Erebor in 2770 of the Third Age, we're going to go back further to find the most likely origin for this chiefest of calamities. After Morgoth is defeated at the end of the First Age, there are still many of his dragons left in Middle-earth, not to mention one Balrog that we know of. And it's with this Balrog where we begin today's story. In 1980 of the Third Age, the Balrog is awakened by the dwarves of Moria under King Durin VI. This leads to Durin's death and the abandonment of Moria by the dwarves. Driven from their home, a contingent of Durin's folk under King Thrain I establish Erebor, the kingdom under the mountain, in 1999. Most of Durin's folk, however, would come to dwell in the Grey Mountains, to the northwest of Erebor. One of the few documented stories about a specific dragon comes in the following year when Skatha the Worm, who had captured treasure from the dwarves of the Grey Mountains, is slain by Fram of the Eothade people, the ancestors of the Rohirrim. You can learn more about these men in my video on the Eothade. Over 200 years after the Lonely Mountain is established, King Thorin I abandons Erebor in 2210, so that he and his people can rejoin the rest of Durin's folk in the Grey Mountains. There they would live in relative peace until the year 2570. Over the years preceding this, the dragons of the north had multiplied and become a mighty force. In 2570, they make war on the dwarves of the Grey Mountains and begin plundering the halls of Durin's folk. Impressively, the dwarves hold their own for 19 years. But in 2589, the dragons come to the halls of King Dain I. The king, his son Fror, and likely many others were slain in the attack. The father and son are killed outside the halls of the king by a cold drake, a name for a dragon that cannot breathe fire. After this final blow in the War of the Dwarves and Dragons, the dwarves of the Grey Mountains abandon their home. With the death of King Dain I, the kingship passes to his son Thror, the grandfather of Thorin Oakenshield. Thror leads his people back to the Lonely Mountain, re-establishing the kingdom of Erebor. Gror, who is the king's youngest brother, leads a group of Durin's folk to the Iron Hills, where they create another settlement. Gror is the grandfather of Dain II, also known as Ironfoot, who would later succeed his cousin Thorin as king under the mountain. It's important to note that we don't know whether Smaug was involved in this conflict in the Grey Mountains. Both Smaug and Gandalf refer to him being young when he comes to Erebor in 2770, but old and strong when Bilbo comes there in 2941. So it's entirely possible that he was either too young to partake in the war, or not even born yet when the war ended in 2589. With the War of the Dwarves and Dragons now over, the dwarves of Erebor would once again have a period of peace, this time for around 180 years. During this time, the kingdom under the mountain flourishes. However, their old enemy would return, in the form of the greatest dragon of the Third Age, Smaug. Like many others, Smaug hears of the tremendous wealth of Erebor, and in 2770, he flies south and sacks the kingdom under the mountain. Tolkien describes Smaug's flight to be like a hurricane. He attacks at night, catching both the dwarves and the men of Dale off guard. It is said that he first lands on the mountain itself before flying down to the woods around Erebor and setting them ablaze. The dwarven warriors come out of the front gate to fight the dragon, but are all killed. Smaug then turns his attention to the warriors of Dale, killing most of them, including Lord Girion, the ancestor of Bard. The dragon then returns to the mountain, slaying more of the dwarves and entering through the front gate. King Thror and his son Thrain II survived the attack by escaping through the secret back door. Thorin, who was just 24 years old at the time, was one of the few dwarves who wasn't inside the mountain during the attack and manages to escape as well. Smaug takes the mountain and the treasure within for his own. In the aftermath, the area of Erebor and Dale, which had been scorched by the dragon, comes to be known as the Desolation of Smaug. Durin's folk, once again forced from their home, are left to their exile, eventually coming to Dunland, where they would live for a time before the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, culminating in the Battle of Azanabalzar in 2799. 3 years later, in 2802, Thrain, now king of his people, settles in the Blue Mountains west of the Shire. For over 170 years, Smaug dwells with his treasure hoard, leaving only occasionally, presumably to hunt for food. We know that he would exit through the Great Gate by night and come to Dale and carry away people, especially maidens, to eat, until Dale is ruined and all the people either dead or gone. Smaug broods upon his treasure for a total of 171 years. This causes a phenomenon known as dragon sickness to come upon the treasure. This is a somewhat mysterious condition, as we really only know it is put upon gold on which a dragon has long brooded. Looking back at our earlier tale of Fram of the Eotheid, who killed the dragon Skatha, he refused to part with any of the treasure, despite the fact that this treasure likely belonged to the dwarves of the Grey Mountains before being taken by the dragon. It is believed that Fram was killed by the dwarves for this offense. Now, if you're curious what the dwarves did during this time that Smaug broods upon his treasure, check out my video on Thorin Oakenshield. We next hear of Smaug when Bilbo Baggins makes his way into the depths of Erebor in October 2941. After Bilbo steals a cup on October 22nd, Smaug takes notice. In The Hobbit, it says, "Dragons may not have real use for all their wealth, but they know it to an ounce as a rule, especially after long possession, and Smaug was no exception." This angers the dragon, who leaves his chamber and searches the mountainside for the culprit. He doesn't find Bilbo or the dwarves, but does manage to find their ponies. The next day, Bilbo returns to Smaug's lair, where they have their famous conversation.
Well, thief, I smell you and I feel your air. I hear your breath. Come along. Help yourself again. There is plenty and to spare.
But Bilbo was not quite so unlearned in dragon lore as all that, and if Smaug hoped to get him to come nearer so easily, he was disappointed. "No thank you, O Smaug the Tremendous," he replied. "I did not come for presents. I only wished to have a look at you and see if you were truly as great as the tales say. I did not believe them."
Do you now?
Said the dragon, somewhat flattered, even though he did not believe a word of it. "Truly, songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities," replied Bilbo.
You have nice manners for a thief and a liar,
said the dragon.
You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you and where do you come from, may I ask?
You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led, and through the air I am he that walks unseen.
So I can well believe,
said Smaug.
But that is hardly your usual name.
I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number.
Lovely titles,
sneered the dragon.
but lucky numbers don't always come off.
I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them alive again from the water.
Shields are offline.
I come from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me.
Severe damage sustained.
These don't sound
All
so
systems are
creditable.
Desecrators
Scoffed
assault our
Smaug.
world.
I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer.
Forces have
I am barrel
engaged the
rider,
enemy.
went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling.
That's better.
More credits are
Said
required.
Smaug.
The unity
But don't
fallen
let your
silent on
imagination
all of our
run
planets.
away with you.
This, of course, is the way to talk to dragons if you don't want to reveal your proper name, which is wise, and don't want to infuriate them by a flat refusal, which is also very wise. No dragon can resist the fascination of riddling talk and wasting time trying to understand it. There was a lot here which Smaug did not understand at all, though I expect you do since you know all about Bilbo's adventures to which he was referring. But he thought he understood enough, and he chuckled in his wicked inside.
I thought so last night.
He smiled to himself.
Lakeman. Some nasty scheme of those miserable tub-trading Lakemen, or I'm a lizard. I haven't been down that way for an age and an age, but I will soon alter that. Very well, O Barrel Rider,
He said aloud.
Maybe Barrel was your pony's name, and maybe not. Though I think it was fat enough. You may walk unseen, but you did not walk all the way. Let me tell you, I ate 6 ponies last night, and I shall catch and eat all the others before long. In return for the excellent meal, I will give you one piece of advice for your good. Do not have more to do with dwarves than you can help.
Dwarves? Said Bilbo in a pretending surprise.
Don't talk to me.
Said Smaug.
I know the smell and taste of dwarf. No one better. Don't tell me that I can eat a dwarf-ridden pony and not know it. You'll come to a bad end if you go with such friends, thief, barrel rider. I don't mind if you go back and tell them so from me.
But he did not tell Bilbo that there was one smell he could not make out at all. Hobbit smell. It was quite outside his experience and puzzled him mightily.
I suppose you got a fair price for that cup last night?
He went on.
Come now, did you? Nothing at all. Well, that's just like them. And I suppose they are skulking outside, and your job is to do all the dangerous work and get what you can when I'm not looking for them? And you will get a fair share?
The item is complete.
Don't you believe it? If you get off alive, you will be lucky.
I tell you, he said, in an effort to remain loyal to his friends and to keep his end up, that gold was only an afterthought with us. We came over hill and under hill by wave and wind for revenge. Surely, O Smaug the unaccessibly wealthy, you must realize that your success has made you some bitter enemies. Then Smaug really did laugh, a devastating sound which shook Bilbo to the floor, while far up in the tunnel the dwarves huddled together and imagined that the hobbit had come to a sudden and a nasty end.
Revenge!
He snorted, and the light of his eyes lit the hall from floor to ceiling like scarlet lightning.
Revenge! The king under the mountain is dead, and where are his kin that dare seek revenge? Girion, Lord of Dale, is dead, and I have eaten his people like a wolf among sheep. And where are his sons that dare approach me? I kill where I wish, and none dare resist. I laid low the warriors of old, and their like is not in the world today. Then I was but young and tender. Now I am old and strong, strong. Thief in the shadows,
He gloated.
My armor is like tenfold shields. My teeth are swords. My claws spears. The shock of my tail a thunderbolt. My wings a hurricane. And my breath death.
Smaug is enraged by the idea that they would dare attempt revenge upon him. Knowing that the men of Lake Town likely assisted this thief and his dwarf friends, he decides to destroy the town on the lake.
Barrel Rider,
He snorted.
your feet came from the waterside, and up the water you came without a doubt. I don't know your smell, but if you are not one of those men of the lake, you had their help. They shall see me and remember Who is the real king under the mountain?
The item
He
is
rose
complete.
in fire and went away south towards the running river. Smaug flies over the lake, avoiding the water so as not to quench his fire. He sets the town ablaze and destroys the great house with a swipe of his tail. As the destruction rages on, a thrush flies to Bard the bowman. Another result of Smaug laying on his treasure for so long is that his stomach possesses armor made of gold and gems, save for one bare spot. The thrush had overheard Bilbo telling the dwarves of the bare spot in Smaug's armor and relays this information to Bard. Bard fires his last arrow, the Black Arrow, which had been passed down from generations past, and hits the spot on the dragon's left breast. Smaug falls from the sky, destroying Esgaroth in his ruin. Smaug is slain, but his effects would be felt for days and years to come. Smaug's treasure would claim at least 2 more victims of dragon sickness. Thorin is the first, as he refuses to part with any of the treasure to help Bard and his people. The second comes after the events of The Hobbit. After Bilbo's back home, he learns from Gandalf and Balin that King Dain had given the Master of Laketown some of the gold to rebuild what the dragon had destroyed. The Master instead takes the gold and flees into the Waste, a region north of the Lonely Mountain, where he would die of starvation. Despite the Master's treachery, Laketown would indeed be rebuilt further north than before. Smaug's bones remained at the location of the former Laketown. It is said that his bones could be seen from the shore, but that no one would dare go into the water to retrieve the gems that had lined his belly. Even in death, Smaug's very bones struck fear into the hearts of men.
While we don't know of any other dragons by name or by deed after Smaug's time, Gandalf implies that there are dragons still around after Smaug's death. In the Fellowship of the Ring, when Gandalf reveals to Frodo that Bilbo's ring is in fact the One Ring, he states, "It has been said that dragonfire could melt and consume the rings of power, but there is not now any dragon left on Earth in which the old fire is hot enough. Nor was there ever any dragon, not even Calagon the Black, who could have harmed the One Ring, the ruling ring, for that was made by Sauron himself." It's yet another fun thing to think about, the possibility of dragons being around after Smaug. While Sauron and Morgoth understandably get much of the attention as all-time great literary villains, I find Smaug and his kind to be worthy of mention as well. In fact, depending on the day, I would often choose Glaurung as my favorite Tolkien villain. Dragons are certainly a very common element of fantasy storytelling. But as with everything from the Professor, there is something truly special about the dragon characters he crafts. From the enormous Calagon, to the vile worm Glaurung, to the cunning fire drake Smaug, the dragons of Middle-earth are among the very best in history. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy Lucinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Next time on Nerd of the Rings. He is the Lord of the Rings, the one who would torment the lands of Middle-earth for 3 ages of the world. But long before he would craft his ring and wage his greatest wars, he would serve as the most trusted lieutenant of Morgoth, assisting him in his conquest and fighting against the mighty heroes of Beleriand. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the life and travels of Sauron throughout all the ages of Middle-earth. In the beginning, Sauron was a Maya known as Mairon, serving under Aule, the smith of the Valar. However, Myron would be swayed to join the evil Vala Melkor. Myron had a love of order and a strong distaste for chaos and confusion. This obsession would take over his love for the other beings in Arda, to the point where it becomes his sole focus. So much so that he admires Melkor and his attempts to shape the world as he sees fit. Myron comes to serve Melkor, becoming his most trusted servant. He becomes known as Gorthaur, meaning terrible dread, among the Sindar, and by his more common name, Sauron, meaning the abhorred, in Quenya. In the earliest days of Middle-earth, Morgoth has two fortresses, Utumno and Angband. While Morgoth would rule the greatest himself, he gives Sauron command of Angband. After the destruction of the two lamps and the awakening of the elves, the Valar decide to move against Morgoth in the Battle of the Powers. While this would primarily be a siege upon Utumno, the Valar in their victory would also search Angband. Sauron, however, would evade their capture and continue to dwell in Middle-earth, while his master is held captive in Valinor for nearly 3,000 years. We know very little of what Sauron does during these long years, aside from biding his time, awaiting the return of his master. This day would eventually come as the Valar give Morgoth a second chance, which he uses to steal the Silmarils, destroy the two trees, which were the sources of light for the world, and flee to Beleriand. With the two trees destroyed, the Valar create the sun and the moon. As the sun rises for the first time, it marks the awakening of the second children of Iluvatar, men. Morgoth sees this as an opportunity to corrupt these new beings to his will, and travels to the east of Middle-earth, leaving Sauron in command of the war between the Dark Forces and the Elves of Beleriand. In the first 455 years of the First Age, Morgoth would only have fairly small victories against the Elves, with the Free Peoples keeping the Dark Lord in check for the most part. In 455, however, Morgoth launches the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, which devastates the plains of Anfauglith, the realm of Dorthonion, and would mark the beginning of Morgoth's gradual march toward domination. Upon seeing the devastation across the plain, King Fingolfin rides to Angband to challenge Morgoth to single combat. Despite putting up a remarkable fight, Fingolfin is crushed by the Dark Lord. The death of the High King of the Noldor and the scorching of the plains opens the door for Sauron to attack the island of Tol Sirion. We are told that at Sauron's coming, absolute fear falls upon Orodreth and the defenders of Tol Sirion. The realm falls to Sauron, and he takes control of the Great Tower of Minas Tirith in the year 457. Tol Sirion is now ruled by Sauron and is renamed Tol Ingauroth, the Isle of Werewolves. Werewolves, while only getting a brief mention in the Third Age by Gandalf, play a much bigger role in the First Age. Not only is Sauron their master, but he is also their creator. These monstrous creatures were bred from the wolves of Morgoth. Sauron would then imprison evil spirits within the bodies, thus creating the monstrous werewolves. At times, Sauron also takes on the form of a wolf himself, in addition to other forms which we'll cover later. After the Dagor Bragollach, Beren, his father Barahir, and a group of men would operate as outlaws in their former lands of Dorthonion. Hearing of the actions of these men, Morgoth orders Sauron to wipe them out. Sauron's orcs managed to capture one of these outlaws, named Gorlim, after he saw what he thought was his wife, who had been missing since the Bragollach. And taking him to their camp, they tormented him, seeking to learn the hidings of Barahir and all his ways. But nothing would Gorlim tell. Then they promised him that he should be released and restored to Eiluned if he would yield. And being at last worn with pain and yearning for his wife, he faltered. Then straight away they brought him into the dreadful presence of Sauron. And Sauron said,
I hear now that thou wouldst barter with me. What is thy price?
And Gorlim answered that he should find Eiluned again, and with her be set free,
for he thought Eilunel also had been made captive. Then Sauron smiled, saying, "That is a small price for so great a treachery. So shall it surely be. Say on." Now Gorlam would have drawn back, but daunted by the eyes of Sauron, he told at last all that he would know. Then Sauron laughed, and he mocked Gorlam, and revealed to him that he had only seen a phantom devised by wizardry to entrap him, for Eilunel was dead. "Nonetheless, I will grant thy prayer," said Sauron, "and thou shalt go to Eilunel and be set free of my service." Then he put him cruelly to death. In 460, Sauron sends a force of orcs to the outlaws' hideout of Tarn Eluin, where all are killed except Beren. Beren continues to operate in the area as a lone outlaw, achieving great deeds against the forces of the Dark Lord. In response, Morgoth sets a high price on Beren's head, leading Sauron to command a great army of werewolves and fell beasts to search for Beren. This forces Beren to flee south, where he would meet Luthien and be tasked by her father Thingol to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. This quest, undertaken in 465, would bring Beren, Galadriel's brother Finrod, and a group of 10 elves to attempt the passage to the north. Finrod uses his magic to disguise the group as orcs, in an effort to pass by Sauron's Isle unnoticed. However, Sauron had ordered all who passed to report to him. When he notices this band of orcs passing without reporting, they are captured and brought before him. There, Finrod and Sauron fight in songs of power, and while both possess great strength, Sauron is more powerful. He strips them of their orc disguises, but cannot determine who they are or what their purpose is. When they refuse to disclose any of this information, Sauron throws all 12 into a dark pit. One by one, they are devoured by a werewolf. Even as they are consumed one by one, Beren and the elves will not betray one another. Finally, Finrod and Beren are the only two who remain. As the werewolf goes to attack Beren, Finrod fights the werewolf, and using every bit of his power left to him, kills it. Finrod soon dies of his wounds from the battle. In this moment, Luthien comes to the bridge of Tolan Galroth and begins to sing. Sauron sees her from his tower of Minas Tirith and knows her to be the daughter of Melian and Thingol. Rather than kill her, he wishes to capture her so that he may deliver her to Morgoth. He sends werewolf after werewolf to the bridge, but they are each killed in turn by Luthien's companion, Huan the Hound. Finally, Sauron sends Draugluin, the great father of the werewolves. After a fierce battle with the Hound, Draugluin flees, telling Sauron of Huan before he dies. Sauron sends no more servants. He will take this battle himself. He takes the form of a werewolf, said to be the greatest the world had ever seen, and comes to the bridge to fight the Hound of Valinor. So great was the terror of his approach that even Huan momentarily recoils from his might. Sauron leaps at Luthien. She draws her magic veil over his eyes, blinding him and afflicting him with fatigue. Huan then jumps upon Sauron and the two fight their brutal fight. It is said Luthien is left weak and very nearly unconscious from the force of Sauron's malice alone. While Sauron fights fiercely, he cannot defeat the Hound. Eventually, Huan traps Sauron within his jaws. In an attempt to escape, Sauron takes the form of a serpent. Still, the Hound holds him captive. Finally, he returns to his normal form. Here, Sauron is faced with a choice. As an immortal spirit, he can abandon his physical form, but as we see in later ages, it takes a long time for him to regain it. Instead, he yields control of the Isle to Luthien in exchange for his release. Now free, he takes the form of a vampire, fleeing to Tar Nufuin, where he fills the forest with horror. 80 years later, in 545, the host of the West,
led by the Maya Eonwe, comes to Beleriand in an effort to overthrow Morgoth. What follows is the 40-year War of Wrath, an unimaginable battle with uncountable combatants and devastation throughout the lands of Beleriand. In the end, Angband is destroyed. Morgoth is once again captured, bound in chains, and his feet are hewn from under him. Sauron, who likely took part in the battle, knows his master is utterly defeated. He takes on a fair form and repents of his evil deeds to Eonwe. Eonwe orders Sauron to return to Valinor, where he may repent to Manwë and receive judgment. However, Sauron is unwilling to endure such humiliation. Instead, he flees to the lands of Middle-earth, where he would hide, biding his time. With his master banished to the void, the time has come for a new Dark Lord. One that would use all his cunning and his craftsmanship to bend Middle-earth to his will. At the start of the Second Age, Sauron has just experienced the massive defeat of his master in the War of Wrath. He is told by Eonwe, the leader of the Host of the West, that he should go to Valinor and be judged for his actions if he truly wished to repent. Instead, Sauron flees, hiding in the lands of Middle-earth. 500 years later, Sauron comes to the conclusion that the Valar have turned a blind eye to Middle-earth. He realizes that he can continue his master's work, becoming the new Dark Lord. Sauron begins to work in the east and the south, among the people who had been influenced by Morgoth centuries earlier. Preying upon these old alliances, he finds followers who fall under his shadow. By 882 of the Second Age, Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, senses a shadow rising in the east. He sends a warning to Numenor. Though the Great Darkness had been defeated centuries earlier in Beleriand, a new power is rising, and they must prepare for an eventual war. Around 1000 of the Second Age, Sauron is alarmed at the growing power of the Númenóreans. Knowing he must create a stronghold of his own, he chooses the lands of Mordor and begins the construction of Barad-dûr near Mount Doom. Always a master at manipulation, Sauron must decide who next to pursue, the elves of Eriador or the men of Númenor. Despite knowing that men were easier to sway, he decides on the elves due to their innate power. He lies hidden for 200 years, all the while increasing his power. Finally, in 1200 of the Second Age, he puts on a fair visage with which to trick the elves. He calls himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. Traveling to Eriador, he claims to be an emissary from the Valar themselves. He wishes to infiltrate Lindon, as it is the greatest and mightiest of the Elven realms, and home of the High King. However, Gil-galad and Elrond do not trust this mysterious entity. While they cannot perceive his true identity, they do not trust him and refuse him entry into their realm. Instead, Annatar comes to another elven realm in Eriador, Eregion. There he is gladly received by the Lord Celebrimbor. We are told that among the people of Eregion, Galadriel alone held distrust for Annatar. However, Celebrimbor is swayed by this Lord of Gifts. The Elven Lord leads the Gwaith y Myrdain, the Brotherhood of Jewelsmiths. And from Annatar, they learn much in both art and magic. Sauron, who was once a servant of Aule, the smith of the Valar, leads the Gwaith y Myrdain to become the greatest smiths of the age. It is said that Celebrimbor became more skilled than any smith to ever live, save for his grandfather, Feanor. By 1500 of the Second Age, after studying under Annatar for nearly 300 years, the Gwaith y Myrdain have reached the pinnacle of their skill and begin forging the Rings of Power. For Annatar had promised them that these rings would help preserve their realms and powers over Middle-earth. After 90 years, the first 16 Rings of Power are completed. At this time, Annatar takes his leave from Eregion, traveling back to Mordor. There, in 1600 of the Second Age, he creates the One Ring, a master ring, into which he pours most of his own power, so that he may control the bearers of the other rings. The ring is inscribed with the iconic phrase, Aj-Naj Durbatuluk, Aj-Naj Gimbatul, Aj-Naj Trakatuluk, Ag-Vorzomishi Kripatul. In one of his first acts using the ring, he completes the construction of Barad-dûr, binding the very foundations of the Dark Tower to the One Ring. However, the elves would perceive his deception as the Dark Lord places the ring upon his finger. Celebrimbor and the other elves are immediately aware of him, realizing they had been betrayed. Celebrimbor locks the 16 within a vault in Eregion, and sends the 3 rings, which he had made himself after Sauron's departure, to Gil-galad in Lindon and Galadriel in Lorien. Above all others, Sauron covets the 3 rings. He demands that the elves give to him all the rings of power. The elves refuse, and the war of the elves and Sauron is now inevitable. Next, Sauron builds the Black Gate of Mordor to prevent invasion into his lands, and begins amassing an army of orcs, trolls, and men who had come to worship him as a god-king. We are told that despite finding many followers among the Easterlings and Southrons, there are still those who oppose him. Due to their resistance, and possibly thanks to the work of the Blue Wizards, it takes Sauron much longer than expected to raise his army. Finally, 95 years after the creation of the One Ring, Sauron launches his war upon Eriador. As Eregion comes under attack, Gil-galad sends an army commanded by Elrond to aid the elves, while also calling for aid from Numenor. After 2 years of bloody conflict, the capital of Ost-in-Edil is sacked. Celebrimbor is captured, and the realm of Eregion is laid waste. Sauron has Elrond and his forces cornered and facing their own destruction, when the dwarves of Khazad-dûm attack Sauron's rear flank, diverting his attention. Elrond leads the survivors, including Galadriel's husband Celeborn, north, where he would found the refuge of Rivendell. The dwarves retreat and shut the gates of Moria, which would not open from the outside again until the time of the Fellowship. Sauron tortures Celebrimbor, and while he would claim the 16 rings, or 15 depending on the version of the story, from the vaults of Eregion, Celebrimbor would not divulge the location of the 3 elven rings. The Elf Lord is killed, and his body placed on a spike and used as a war banner as Sauron continues his brutal war. By 1699, Sauron has conquered nearly all of Eriador, and the elves in Lindon and Rivendell are facing a vast and powerful army seeking their destruction. At this moment, Sauron's control over Middle-earth is as vast as it will ever be. At no time before or after would he rule over such a large area. As the situation is at its most dire, the Númenóreans answer Lindon's call. They reinforce the elves and drive Sauron back from the front lines along the River Lune. Sauron retreats to Sarn Ford, where he is defeated again. He retreats further to Tharbad, where he is reinforced from the southeast. However, Sauron was not aware of a second fleet sent by Númenor's king to the mouth of the Gwathlo. This force attacks from the southwest, while Gil-galad and the other Númenóreans attack from the north. Sauron's army is decimated, and the Dark Lord barely escapes himself. By the time Sauron returns to Mordor, he is left with just a small personal guard. Gil-galad defeats the cut-off forces laying siege to Imladris, and Sauron's defeat in Eriador is complete. While Sauron's might would never again equal what it was during his conquest of Eriador, his enemies have been decimated as well. so he faces no
The Unity
immediate
calls
threat.
us to action.
He holds a deep hatred for the Numenorians,
Civilian
those who had
structure
snatched
complete.
away his
The
ultimate
item is
victory.
complete.
Eventually, he would turn his attention to the island realm, using other means than strength of arms.
Shields compromised.
Still possessing
We're
the 16
vulnerable.
rings of power,
Seek your
all of which
guidance.
were originally intended for the
Destruction is
elves,
at hand.
Sauron decides instead to
Shields are
target the other
compromised.
races of Middle-earth. 7 rings come to the Dwarven Lords, who would prove too hardy to be enslaved by the
We are
One.
listening.
The 9, however,
Production
are
of
given
the
to
item
men.
is complete.
3 corrupted lords of
Our
Numenor,
forces have
an
engaged the
Easterling
enemy.
king named Kamul, and 5 other men whose identities are a mystery. While initially becoming great rulers, warriors, and sorcerers, the 9 would fade, and in 2251,
severely crippled.
they first appear
Is the unity
as the
with
Ring
us?
Wraiths, the greatest of Sauron's slaves. Over 1500 years after his defeat in Eriador, Sauron is confident that he will again rise to great power and dominate all of Middle-earth. Sauron declares himself King of Men, Lord of the Earth, and many similarly boastful titles. By this time, Numenor has fallen under a shadow, its leaders becoming oppressive and cruel, and most of the people turning their backs upon the Valar and the Eldar. Sauron's titles offend one of the most evil of all Numenor's kings, Ar-Pharazôn. In 3262, Ar-Pharazôn lands a great fleet at the haven of Umbar and marches to Mordor. So great was the splendor of Numenor that Sauron's armies flee and desert him. Knowing he cannot match Numenor with military might, he again takes his fair form, surrendering to Ar-Pharazôn. Sauron is taken back to Numenor as a captive, but as we see time and again, the Dark Lord has far more dangerous weapons than brute strength. He quickly goes from prisoner to the king's chief advisor within that very year. Sauron seduces the king with his words, turning him further away from the Valar and toward his dark master. It is he whose name is not now spoken, for the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom, devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in servitude to themselves. For they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. But he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom. And his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they. Known as Zigur the Wizard, the Dark Lord convinces the king to cut down the sacred white tree, and in its place they build a great temple for the worship of Morgoth. There he serves as the high priest of the cult of Melkor, practicing human sacrifice among both slaves and the Numenorians faithful to the Valar. Finally, in 3310, Sauron convinces an aging Ar-Pharazôn that the only way that he can avoid death, the doom of man, is to take the lands of the Valar by force. For the next 9 years, Ar-Pharazôn and the evil Numenorians construct the Great Armament, the mightiest naval force ever assembled. As Ar-Pharazôn sails for Valinor, Sauron remains behind in the Temple of Melkor. As the Numenorians land in Valinor, Eru himself intervenes, breaking the very world. Pharazôn and his army are buried under the earth, and Numenor is plunged into the sea. Sauron is caught in the destruction of the island, and while his body is destroyed, his spirit endures. Despite being weakened, his spirit flees back to Middle-earth in 3320. Once again, he sets to work, slowly but surely regaining his strength. However, from this point on, he is no longer able to take his fair form. With this development, he abandons his attempts to manipulate in order to gain power, and instead seeks to rule through terror and force, truly becoming the next great Dark Lord. Some of the evil Numenorians who had lived in places like Umbar survived the downfall, becoming known as the Black Numenorians and remaining loyal to Sauron. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, those among the faithful also survive and found the realms of Gondor and Arnor. These people of Elendil remain Sauron's most hated enemies, and in 3429, he launches an attack in an attempt to prevent them from growing too great in power. Driven from his city of Minas Ithil, Isildur reports to his father in the north. There, Gil-galad would once again ally with the men of Numenor in working against Sauron, forming the last alliance of elves and men. Hearing of this new threat, Sauron sends orcs from Mordor to the Misty Mountains in an attempt to ambush the army. He also burns the gardens of the Entwives in an effort to slow the army's march to Mordor. Despite these moves, the last alliance reaches the Black Gate in 3434, where they are victorious in the Battle of Dagorlad, the very battle that resulted in the Dead Marshes. For the next 7 years, Sauron's Tower of Barad-dûr is under siege. Finally, in 3441, Sauron himself comes forth to face his enemies in combat. The Dark Lord drives back the last alliance to Mount Doom. Elendil and Gil-galad, the mighty kings of the men and elves, fight Sauron upon the slopes of Orodruin. Elendil and Gil-galad would succeed in vanquishing the Dark Lord, yet the deed would cost both their lives. Coming up to Sauron's fallen body, Isildur, the son of Elendil, cuts the One Ring from his finger, claiming it as his own in recompense for his fallen father and brother. Sauron's spirit would once again flee, this time to the east. It would take the Dark Lord 1,000 years to return to the western lands of Middle-earth. Without his ruling ring, his path to regaining a body would be slow. And as we enter the Third Age, we find a Sauron who uses his servants to fight his battles, as he seeks to isolate and destroy those who would oppose him, all the while coveting the return of his One Ring. While his defeat against the last alliance would release his subjects, like many of the Easterlings, from his direct rule, these lands would fall into chaos and civil war. No doubt Sauron hiding in the east didn't help the situation. Around 1050 of the Third Age, a shadow comes to the forest of Greenwood. It would settle at the former capital of the Elves of Greenwood, called Amon Lanc. With this dark presence dwelling in Amon Lanc, it would come to be known as the Hill of Sorcery, Dol Guldur, and this entity would be known as the Necromancer. For 250 years, Sauron's power and presence would grow. Not only does this present an evil presence in the south of Mirkwood, but it leads to other signs of growing evil throughout Middle-earth. The orcs of the Misty Mountains become more bold against their enemies. The dragons of the north attack the dwarves, likely consuming many of the dwarven rings of power. And the Nazgul return, with the Witch King founding the Kingdom of Angmar in 1300. In 1635, a great plague inflicts much of Middle-earth. It is described as a pestilence brought by an evil wind from the east. This plague, likely brought about by Sauron himself, devastates the areas of Rhovanion, Gondor, Rhûn, and southern Eriador. Due to the enormous loss of life, Gondor is forced to retreat inward, abandoning the fortresses which guarded Mordor, thus opening the door for the Nazgul to return. At this time, the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor realize that the enemies they are facing are being coordinated by a single force and agree to work together. However, as we've covered in our video on the Angmar Wars, the kingdom of Arnor would fall to ruin and decay at the hands of the Witch King. While Angmar would be destroyed by a combined force of elves and Gondorians in 1975, Arnor, now kingless and decimated, is abandoned. Its legacy carried on only in its ancient monuments, the Rangers of the North, and the Line of Isildur. 5 years later, a Balrog is awakened in Moria, leading to the death of King Durin VI and the dwarves' exile from Khazad-dûm. After being driven out of Eriador, the Lord of the Nazgul returns to Mordor, and in 2050, he causes the disappearance and likely death of the last king of Gondor. To this point, everything has gone pretty well for Sauron. Arnor is no more, dragons and Balrogs have weakened the dwarves, and Gondor now has no king. However, Sauron's power has grown to a point that the wise take notice, and in 2063, Gandalf enters the fortress of Dol Guldur. Still appearing as a mysterious shadow and not ready to declare himself openly, Sauron flees before Gandalf can determine his true identity. As he is wont to do, he returns to the east, once again corrupting the Easterlings from within, playing on old allegiances not only to himself, but to Morgoth. For nearly 400 years, Sauron would work in the east, building alliances for his eventual war. This period in the west of Middle-earth is known as the Watchful Peace. The shadow in Mirkwood is lessened, with only the second in command of the Nazgul, Khamul the Easterling, stationed in Dol Guldur. The other 8 remain in Minas Morgul, preparing for their master's return. In 2460, he would indeed return to Middle-earth, coming back to Dol Guldur, but now with an army awaiting his command in the east. 3 years later, the One Ring is found by one of the Stoor hobbits in the Anduin River, not far away. At this point, sensing the danger growing once again, the wise form the White Council, though for centuries, Saruman, as its leader, would prevent the council from moving against the presence in Dol Guldur. At this time, Sauron's goals are simple. Gather as many rings of power as he can, including the One Ring, and destroy the line of Isildur, which he had not forgotten and still harbored a deep hatred for. Once again, we see Sauron's influence as evil forces begin to move throughout Middle-earth. In the south, Uruk-hai come from Mordor and briefly take control of Ithilien from Gondor. 5 years later, the orcs of the Misty Mountains have made themselves strongholds within the mountains to prevent passage from east to west. With Moria having been abandoned by the dwarves due to the Balrog centuries earlier, Sauron sends orcs and trolls to live in the former dwarven realm. Around this time, a clan of Easterlings under the sway of Sauron amasses east of Mirkwood and begins raiding the areas of the forest and the Vales of Anduin. This force, known as the Balkoth, attacks the Gondorian realms of Calenarthon in 2510. However, a group of men living in the north of Middle-earth would ride to Gondor's aid. As the Eotheid make their way south, it is likely Sauron would have moved against them in some way, but Galadriel sends out a mist to cover their passing by Dol Guldur. They come to the field of Celebrant, where the Balkoth are defeated. As a reward, they are given the lands of Calenarthon, which becomes known as the Kingdom of Rohan. While this development is not ideal for Sauron, his plans march on. In 2845, Sauron's forces capture King Thrain II, the father of Thorin Oakenshield. The dwarf is imprisoned in Dol Guldur, and Sauron claims one of the coveted Rings of Power. 5 years later, Gandalf makes his way to Dol Guldur, seeking to investigate the Necromancer once again. He meets the dying dwarf, and his long-thought fear is confirmed. The Necromancer is Sauron. Despite Gandalf's urging, Saruman once again overrules him, and the White Council does not move against Sauron. Saruman hopes that as Sauron's power grows, he will be able to decipher where Sauron is searching for the One Ring. In time, Sauron learns of Isildur's death at the Gladden Fields, and his servants begin searching the area. Meanwhile, in the south, agents of Sauron influence the Haradrim to attack Gondor, while the Uruk-hai once again attack the lands of Ithilien, weakening one of Sauron's most hated enemies. At this point, Sauron is finding success in both the north and the south. Gondor is in conflict with Mordor and Harad. The orcs of the Misty Mountains and Gundabad have created strongholds dividing east from west. And all the while, Sauron's own power grows in Dol Guldur. Gandalf sees these pieces of the board moving, but also sees an even more terrible threat. The dragon Smaug now controls Erebor, and if he were to ally with Sauron, the north of Middle-earth including Rivendell and Lorien, will surely fall. If this came to pass, Sauron could crush Gondor and Rohan between his northern and southern forces. This threat leads Gandalf to implement a plan to move against both Smaug and Sauron simultaneously. In a stroke of fortune, Saruman in 2939 discovers that Sauron has been searching the Gladden Fields for the One Ring, leading him to finally agree to attack Dol Guldur. As Smaug is slain by Bard the Bowman, the White Council drives Sauron from Mirkwood. Not only is Sauron driven from Dol Guldur, but the armies of orcs from Gundabad and the Misty Mountains are decimated in the Battle of the Five Armies. The dwarves reclaim Erebor, Dale flourishes under King Bard, and Sauron's plans for his northern campaign are ruined. A year later, Sauron returns to Mordor, and from 2951 to 2953, the fortress of Barad-dûr is rebuilt. Sauron is now ready to move against Middle-earth, and declares himself openly once more. Through the power of Sauron, a phenomenon known as the Shadow of Mordor emanates from the lands, causing despair and sickness among the Gondorians. It is this shadow that would claim the life of Finduilas, the wife of Denethor and mother of Boromir and Faramir in 2988. Rather than being directly involved in the coming war himself, Sauron would largely act through devices like this shadow, his servants, or through one of the Palantir. This Palantir, taken from the former Minas Ithil when the Nazgul conquered it, allows Sauron to not only communicate with other Seeing Stones, but with his great power glimpse places throughout the world. In the aftermath of his wife's death, Denethor begins using the Anor Stone. Seeing this, Sauron attempts to bend the Anor Stone to his will, but is unsuccessful. Denethor's will is too strong to be conquered in this way, though this struggle would wear on him and cause him to lose hope. Around the year 3000, Saruman begins using the Orthanc Stone. Once again, Sauron attempts to bend the user to his will, but this time he is successful. Saruman goes from being one of his biggest threats to one that would aid him greatly during the coming war, though as we will see, he remains a threat for treachery. 9 years later, Gollum makes his way to Mordor in pursuit of Bilbo and of news regarding the One Ring. He is captured by Sauron's forces, interrogated, and tortured for the following 8 years. Finally, he is released in January 3017. It's worth noting at this point a major misconception regarding Sauron's form. In the Peter Jackson films, Sauron is famously a giant lidless eye of flame. However, in truth, Sauron at this time, and likely even earlier in Dol Guldur, had a physical form. Gollum would later tell Sam and Frodo,
Yes, he has only 4 fingers on the black hand, but they are enough.
So this begs the question, what is the Eye of Sauron that is mentioned in the books? While Sauron no doubt had physical eyes, as Frodo describes a piercing eye rimmed with fire at the Mirror of Galadriel, and on the slopes of Mount Doom, it is not that his entire being is a giant eye. Rather, the Eye of Sauron is most notably the symbol which his forces display on their weaponry, standing for his unrelenting vigilance and perception toward his enemies, which is no doubt aided with his use of the Palantir. Now that we've covered his form, let's get back to Sauron's actions. After Gollum is released in 3017, he's captured by Aragorn and taken to the Elves of Mirkwood. Sauron, who had hoped Gollum's release would lead to the One Ring being revealed to him, is concerned by this development. On June 20th, 3018, he sends his forces to attack Osgiliath, not only to test Gondor's strength, but to cover his sending out of the Nazgul to search for the ring. The Nazgul's secrecy is a success, but the strength of Gondor is greater than Sauron had hoped. His forces are driven back to Mordor, where he spends the following months amassing his army in preparation for a massive assault on Gondor. On this same day, in the north, he sends a group of orcs from Dol Guldur to attack Mirkwood, allowing Gollum to escape. By September 3018, Sauron has learned that Boromir, son of the Steward, has left Minas Tirith that Gandalf has been captured by Saruman, and that Saruman has been working against him by thwarting his spies. He sends messengers to the Nazgul, ordering them to abandon secrecy and make haste for Isengard. The Ringwraiths would discover enough clues to lead them to the Shire, and they would pursue the Ringbearer to the borders of Rivendell. In the coming months, Sauron learns that Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, has joined the Fellowship of the Ring. This leads Sauron to proceed at a quicker pace than intended with readying his forces. When Pippin and Aragorn look into the Orthanc Stone, following Saruman's defeat at Helm's Deep, Sauron incorrectly assumes that Aragorn now possesses the One Ring. Once again rushing to act, he sends the Witch King and a great army to Minas Tirith. Around the same time of the Battle of Pelennor Fields, he sends a large group of Easterlings to attack the northern realm of Dale. The Battle of Dale and the resulting siege would begin on March 14th and would last until the 27th, 2 days after the ring is destroyed, when the forces of Sauron lose hope and are driven out by the armies of dwarves and men. As we know, in the south, things wouldn't go much better for Sauron. His army is defeated at Pelennor Fields, and his greatest servant is killed by Merry and Éowyn. Despite this defeat, he has managed to weaken the armies of Gondor and Rohan, while he maintains enough strength in Mordor to defeat them. However, Gandalf once again forces Sauron into hasty action. The wizard advises the Lords of the West to march on Mordor itself. As this smaller army of free peoples marches to the Black Gate, Sauron's piercing gaze concentrates on the heir of Isildur rather than on his own lands, where two hobbits draw closer and closer to Mount Doom. As Sauron is poised to wipe out the army of men and finally end the line of Isildur, Frodo puts on the One Ring. In this moment, Sauron sees the hobbit and his location and realizes he has been tricked. He orders the remaining Nazgul to make all haste to the mountain. However, Gollum would intervene, and in his celebration at taking the ring back from Frodo, slips and falls into the fires below. Thus, Sauron's power is unmade. His physical form is destroyed. His spirit rises above the lands of Mordor like a black cloud. But in that moment, a powerful wind from the west blows the cloud away. Sauron, now permanently and completely defeated, could do nothing but follow his former master into the timeless void, never to rise again. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.
Stand by for phase jump. We shall overcome.
Melkor, the original Dark Lord of Middle-earth. After sowing discord in the creation of the world, he goes on to wreak havoc upon its inhabitants. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we begin our look at the entire life of Tolkien's most evil and most powerful Dark Lord. In the beginning, Eru Ilúvatar, the god of Tolkien's world, creates the Ainur, that is the Valar and the Maiar. Melkor is among the Valar, and the mightiest of them all. In his impatience to fill the void with created life, he searches throughout the void for the flame imperishable, the mysterious power of Eru that allows him to create and give life. Melkor is unable to locate the flame imperishable, as it is not located in the void, but with Eru himself. You're likely familiar with the other name for the flame imperishable, the Secret Fire, which Gandalf references during his fight with the Balrog. As Melkor wanders through the void, he comes to have ideas different than those of the other Ainur. He grows rebellious against Eru and wishes to create life himself. Without the flame imperishable, however, he is unable to create life, but can merely corrupt and twist it, as we will see later. When it comes time for the creation of the universe, the Ainur make a great music. At this time, Melkor weaves his own thoughts into his song, which clashes with the theme of Iluvatar. This causes some of the Ainur around him to change their music to his. For a time, the theme of Iluvatar and the discord of Melkor battle one another. Eru smiles and sends forth a second theme. Most of the Ainur join this new theme, but Melkor opposes it even more violently with his discord. Finally, shocked at what they are witnessing, many of the Ainur stop singing and Melkor's discord gains the upper hand. Eru then begins a third theme, sweeter and more beautiful than the previous two. This theme cannot be beaten by Melkor. Still, he opposes the music of Eru. Finally, Eru stops the music completely with a single chord of his own. As we read in the Silmarillion, the music ceased. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar. Those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." Melkor is shamed and angered by this rebuke, but hides his feelings. As the Ainur see the work of their song, Melkor is among those who beg Eru to allow them to enter Arda. Melkor pretends to have a desire to guide the world and its inhabitants for Eru's glory, but secretly, he desires to dominate Arda and its creatures, especially the forthcoming Children of Iluvatar, that is, the elves and men. Along with the other Valar, Melkor enters Ea, the created universe, and makes his way to Arda, the world. After they arrive, Melkor drops his facade, declaring to the other Valar that he is now master of Arda. Manwë, who is Melkor's brother, fears that Melkor will attempt to disrupt their labors in Arda, and calls forth more Ainur to protect them. Melkor leaves, making his way to the remote regions of Ea. As the Valar work to form Arda, Melkor seeks to destroy or taint anything they create. He demolishes their mountains, raises their valleys, and spills their seas. Aule's works are among the most affected by Melkor's deeds. After uncounted battles and years pass, news reaches the Ainur, who remained with Eru. Hearing of the war, Tulkas, the most warlike of all the Valar, comes to Arda in the Valiant year 1499. Melkor flees before the laughter and anger of Tulkas, escaping beyond the walls of night. From that moment on, he will forever possess a hatred of Tulkas. Now I want to give some context for how time is measured during this age of the Earth. Valiant years equal just over 9.5 of our own years. So from the Valar arriving in Arda in Valiant year 1 to Melkor fleeing in Valiant year 1499, well over 14,000 years pass. As the remaining Valar work to restore Arda as best they can, Melkor dwells in the outer darkness. The Valar complete Arda and raise up 2 lamps which give the world light. They dwell in a land called Almaren. Unfortunately, Melkor's power earns him a following among some of the Maiar, which at this time likely includes Sauron. Some act as his spies, and eventually, he meets with them as the Valar hold a feast after completing their work. It is at this feast that Tulkas marries Nessa. As Nessa dances before the Valar, Tulkas falls into a peaceful sleep. Melkor, looking down in hatred, decides his time to strike has come. Melkor and his followers come over the walls of night, returning to Arda. He delves deep into the earth, creating the fortress of Utumno in the Iron Mountains of the north. Evil flows from the fortress. Death and illness strike at the vegetation of Arda. Animals fight and kill one another, and the Valar come to realize Melkor has returned. The Valar begin to search for Melkor's hiding place, but the future Dark Lord strikes first. He comes to Almaren and destroys the city and the 2 lamps.
But Melkor assailed the lights of Iluin and Ormal, and cast down their pillars and broke their lamps. In the overflow of the mighty pillars, lands were broken and seas arose in tumult. And when the lamps were spilled, destroying flame was poured out over the earth. And the shape of Arda and the symmetry of its waters and its lands was marred in that time, so that the first designs of the Valar were never restored. As the world is filled with fire and water and chaos, Melkor escapes, returning to his fortress. The spring of Arda, what should have been a joyous occasion, ends in disaster, as the Valar must use all their power to hold the world together. With their home destroyed, the Valar travel across the sea and come to a new land, Aman. There, they build the city of Valmar and create new sources of light, the two trees. This ushers in a new era for Arda, the years of the trees. These are measured in the same manner as Valian years, every year being 9.5 of our own. Once we make our way into the first, second, and third ages, the years of Middle-earth are equal to our own. With the Valar now across the sea, Melkor is relatively free to roam Middle-earth, though some among the Valar appear in Middle-earth to thwart him as they are able. One is Ulmo, who will come into play quite a bit during the First Age. Yavanna is also mentioned as taking action in Middle-earth, and Orome, the huntsman, would ride throughout Middle-earth, delighting in hunting down and killing the monsters of Melkor. Believing the Valar might move against him, Melkor dwells in his fortress, building his strength and breeding monsters. He also gathers the Maiar who are loyal to him. These servants, cloaking themselves in shadow and flame, come to be known as Balrogs. During this time, he also constructs the fortress of Angband, where he places his greatest servant, Sauron. In the year of the trees 1050, the first elves awake at Cuiviénen. While the hunter Orome comes across them, so does Melkor. He racks the elves with fear, killing or capturing many in his time. Through the torture of his captives and other foul works, it is believed Melkor creates the race of orcs. After the Valar discover the elves, Manwë concludes it is the will of Eru to reclaim the lands of Middle-earth from Melkor. The Valar come to Middle-earth in the year of the trees 1090 to do battle with Melkor. This massive war of the gods begins with an army of the west confronting Melkor's forces in the northwest of Middle-earth. The entire region is ruined by the battle. The Valar are victorious in this first battle as the servants of Melkor retreat to Utumno. For the next 2 years, the Valar place guards in the land around the Bay of Cuiviénen, protecting the elves who had first awakened there. The Valar lay siege to Melkor's fortress. From where they stand, far away from the conflict, the elves can see only fires in the north and feel a mighty shaking of the earth. Finally, in the year of the trees 1099, the Valar break the gates and roof of Utumno. Melkor hides in the deepest pits of his fortress, but Tulkas arrives and binds him in the chain Angainor, which Aule the Smith had forged. While Utumno is destroyed in this final act, the Valar don't discover all the deepest, darkest places within. Sauron and many of the Balrogs manage to escape capture. In the aftermath of this long war, Middle-earth is changed. New mountain ranges are raised up, the Great Sea becomes larger, and new lands and waterways take shape. The Valar drew Melkor back to Valinor, bound hand and foot and blindfold, and he was brought to the Ring of Doom. There, he lay upon his face before the feet of Manwë and sued for pardon, but his prayer was denied, and he was cast into prison in the fastness of Mandos, whence none can escape, neither Vala, nor elf, nor mortal man. Vast and strong are those halls, and they were built in the west of the land of Aman. There was Melkor doomed to abide for 3 ages long, before his cause should be tried anew, or he should plead again for pardon. So Melkor is imprisoned within the halls of Mandos, roughly 2,850 years. All the while, he plots his revenge. As this time passes, many of the elves would come to dwell in Aman. This is a large topic in itself, so we'll cover it in a future video. After the 3 ages pass, Melkor is once again brought before his brother. Melkor bows down, prostrating himself once again before Manwë, begging for pardon. Manwë releases him from his captivity,
much to the displeasure of Tulkas and Ulmo. The Valar decree that he will not return to Middle-earth, instead staying in Aman, where they can keep watch on him. In secret, Melkor begins working to corrupt the elves, for whom he holds a grudge, as it was for their safety that the Valar came to Middle-earth to overthrow him. As Melkor assesses the elves, he realizes the Vanyar, the elves that would forever dwell in Aman, do not trust him. The Teleri, who you may remember as being known for their shipbuilding, Melkor deems too weak to be effective in his plans. In the Noldor, however, he finds a curious people who are eager to learn from the Valar, even himself. In the year of the trees 1169, one among the Noldor is born who would be Melkor's most bitter enemy, but also his greatest tool for his evil purposes. Feanor, the creator of the Palantiri, and most importantly, the Silmarils, 3 great gems which shone with the light of the 2 trees. Melkor begins to spread rumors throughout the Noldor. He tells of Middle-earth and its wide lands, realms they would be free to rule were it not for the Valar keeping them in Aman. This distrust of the Valar and desire to rule takes hold in the hearts of many of the Noldor, especially Feanor. Melkor sows even more discord within the House of Finwë between Feanor and his younger half-brother, Fingolfin. Manipulating Feanor's pride and quick temper, Melkor convinces Feanor that Fingolfin plans to usurp his place as their father's heir and take the Silmarils from him. After Feanor threatens to kill Fingolfin in 1490, the Valar banish him to Formenos, where he takes the Silmarils as well. In solidarity, Finwë also moves to Formenos to be with his son. Realizing that Melkor was pulling the strings in this feud, Tulkas goes to imprison him, but finds him gone. 2 years of the trees later, Melkor reappears at Formenos, seeking to further influence Feanor. This time, however, Morgoth goes too far and Feanor recognizes Melkor for what he is. Feanor's heart was still bitter at his humiliation before Mandos, and he looked at Melkor in silence, pondering if indeed he might yet trust him so far as to aid him in his flight. And Melkor, seeing that Feanor wavered, and knowing that the Silmarils held his heart in thrall, said at the last, "Here is a strong place, and well guarded, but think not that the Silmarils will lie safe in any treasury within the realm of the Valar." But his cunning overreached his aim. His words touched too deep, and awoke a fire more fierce than he designed. And Feanor looked upon Melkor with eyes that burned through his fair semblance, and pierced the cloaks of his mind, perceiving there his fierce lust for the Silmarils. Feanor slams the door in his face, and Melkor flees once again, making his way south to the Valley of Avathar. There he finds a mysterious dark spirit which takes the form of a giant spider, Ungoliant. Melkor promises her rich reward for her assistance, and she weaves a cloak of shadow around Melkor and herself to hide them in their travels. In 1495, the Valar seek reconciliation with the Noldor, and between Feanor and Fingolfin. They all assemble in Valmar. Meanwhile, Melkor and Ungoliant make their way to the 2 trees. And in that very hour, Melkor and Ungoliant came hastening over the fields of Valinor, as the shadow of a black cloud upon the wind fleets over the sunlit earth. And they came before the green mound, Ezelohar. Then the unlight of Ungoliant rose up even to the roots of the trees, and Melkor sprang upon the mound, and with his black spear he smote each tree to its core, wounded them deep, and their sap poured forth as if it were their blood, and was spilled upon the ground. But Ungoliant sucked it up, and going then from tree to tree, she set her black beak to their wounds till they were drained, and the poison of death that was in her went into their tissues and withered them, root, branch, and leaf, and they died. The light of the trees extinguished, the world is once again plunged into darkness. After Ungoliant drinks the entirety of the wells of Varda, they go north to Formenos. There, Melkor kills Finwë and steals the Silmarils and other gems of Feanor. Ungoliant, who grows in size after consuming the sap of the 2 trees, flees with Melkor across the Helcaraxe and into Middle-earth. Once they arrive, Ungoliant, in her insatiable hunger, demands Melkor give her the treasure. Melkor, who is now very weak from his deeds, fears the monstrous spider. He gives her each of the gems of Feanor, as she, in turn, consumes each one. She then demands the Silmarils, but Melkor refuses. Ungoliant uses her webs to trap the Vala and nearly devours him. Melkor gives a great cry, which summons the Balrogs from Angband. With their whips, they drive away Ungoliant and return their master to what remains of his old fortress. There, Melkor sets the Silmarils in an iron crown, which from that moment onward, he will never willingly remove. This despite the fact that the crown is a great burden to him. Back in Aman, Feanor returns to Formenos to find his father slain and the Silmarils gone. Feanor curses Melkor and gives him a new name, which the elves and men will forever know him by. A name meaning black foe or dark tyrant. The Vala Melkor is now known as the Dark Lord Morgoth. As Feanor claims kingship of the Noldor and leads many to Middle-earth, Morgoth, in his fortress of Angband, the Silmarils upon his crown, declares himself king of all the world. For the next 600 years, the elves and Morgoth would be at war. After his return to Middle-earth, he is often referred to as Morgoth Bauglir. Bauglir is a Sindarin name, meaning the constrainer. He sets his sights on the elves that didn't make the journey to Valinor. The Sindar, under King Thingol, live in Doriath. Círdan and the Teleri live at Falas, and Denethor and the Nandor live in Osiriand. Morgoth moves against these elves in the year of the trees 1497, sending his army of orcs to surround Thingol in Doriath. Thingol manages to contact Denethor, who comes to their aid. The orcs of Morgoth, caught between two armies of elves, are defeated. As the orcs flee north, they are unexpectedly routed by the dwarves of Mount Dolmed. The orcs on the western front continue to besiege Círdan's elves at the havens of Falas for the following few months, until the coming of the Noldor would draw them away. Speaking of the Noldor, with the world in darkness, Feanor leads the Noldor to rebel against the Valar. Many of those following Feanor take part in the kinslaying, in which many Teleri are killed so that Feanor may claim their ships. They sail east to Beleriand, landing at Loskar. When Feanor burns the ships, it not only signals to Fingolfin that he and the rest of the Noldor are now stranded in Aman, but also draws the attention of Morgoth. In a preemptive strike, he sends forth a force of orcs and werewolves, which passes through the arid Wethrin and attacks the elves. Though the orcs greatly outnumber the Noldor, the elves possess great power within them, thanks to the light of Valinor. They defeat Morgoth's force. The orcs retreat across the plain of Ardgallan and back toward Angband. At this time, the orcs that had besieged Círdan come north to aid their allies. However, they are pushed back to the Fen of Serek. In total, very few orcs survive the 10-day battle. Feanor pursues this small group to the Dor Daedeloth, the land of the shadow of horror. There, the Balrogs come out from Thangorodrim. Feanor fights valiantly against these demons of Morgoth, but is separated from his sons and is fatally wounded by Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs. The armies of his sons would reach him just in time to drive off the Balrogs, but Morgoth's enemy would die of his wounds soon after. This conflict would come to be known as the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the Battle Under Stars, as it takes place prior to the creation of the sun and moon. With his father dead, Maethrost is now the High King of the Noldor. Morgoth sends an offer of peace to Maethrost, even saying he will surrender a Silmaril. Maethrost does not trust the Dark Lord and brings a force with him to the meeting. Morgoth sends an even greater force and captures Maethrost, the sole survivor of his group. Morgoth tells the Noldor to leave Beleriand and forsake their war against him. However, the sons of Feanor are bound to their oath to make war on anyone who should withhold the Silmarils from them. Morgoth hangs Maethrost upon a precipice of Thangorodrim by the wrist of his right hand, and there he would hang for the next 30 years. The rest of the Noldor arrive around the time the sun and the moon are created by the Valar, making this year one of the First Age of Middle-earth.
This group is led by Feanor's half-brother and Galadriel's uncle, Fingolfin, who would become Morgoth's next challenger. In the year 5 of the First Age, Fingolfin's son, Fingon, with the help of Thorondor, the Lord of the Great Eagles, rescues Maethros from Thangorodrim. Maethros renounces his claim to the kingship of the Noldor, and Fingolfin is made the new High King. Over the coming years, Morgoth spies believe that as the elves are making their settlements, they aren't prepared for military conflict. Morgoth sends out an army of orcs to attack. The main host attacks Dorthonion, while smaller groups go through Maglor's Gap and the Pass of Sirion. The Noldor, however, were anything but unprepared. While the orcs in the east and west are destroyed by smaller elven forces, Fingolfin in the west and Maethros in the east strike back at the main host of the invading orc army. Most of Morgoth's force is defeated there in Dorthonion, with a small remnant fleeing toward Angband. The elves chase them down, and there, within the sight of Thangorodrim itself, the Noldor slay the remaining orcs. This battle is known as the Dagor Agreleb, the Glorious Battle, as it is a huge victory for the elves. The Noldor set as much a border around Morgoth's land as possible, thus beginning the 400-year siege of Angband. During this time, Morgoth comes to realize orcs alone will not defeat the Noldor, so he devises new creatures of evil, the dragons. The first of these is Glaurung, who emerges without Morgoth's permission in 260 of the First Age. Despite an initial success, the young dragon is humbled by the elven archers and forced to flee back to Angband. Nearly 200 years later, however, as Glaurung is grown to his full might, Morgoth sends forth great rivers of fire over Ardgallen, burning many elves stationed throughout the land. As the elves are in disarray, Glaurung leads a force of Balrogs and an army of orcs, killing all in their sight. This battle can be looked at on two fronts, the east and the west. In the west, Galadriel's brothers Angrod and Agnor are killed fighting for their home realm of Dorthonion. Finrod, her last remaining sibling and Lord of Nargothrond, would have been killed as he is surrounded at the Fen of Serek, but a group of men led by Barahir, a lord of the House of Beor, comes to their aid. Finrod would later give him a ring as a token of the everlasting friendship between their families, the Ring of Barahir, which would one day pass to Aragorn. In the end, the elves and men are able to keep the western realms of Hithlum safe. In the east, things do not go so well. This battle, known as the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, not only costs many lives of elves and men, but it also breaks the siege of Angband, and allows Morgoth's forces to move freely throughout the north of Beleriand. Orcs take control of the lands of Lothlin, including the important positions of Maglor's Gap and Mount Rerir. Glaurung burns the lands between the arms of Gelion, and the Thargelion and Lake Helivorn are ravaged by Morgoth's forces. With many refugees fleeing to places like Doriath and Hithlum, the elves abandon their realm of Dorthonion, which becomes known as Tar Nufuin, Forest under Nightshade. After a year of smaller battles, the High King Fingolfin gets word of the devastation the war has wrought in Dorthonion and Lothlin. Seeing what he believes could be the utter ruin of the Noldor, he rides in anger across the scorched land of Anfauglith, coming to the very door of Angband to confront Morgoth. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn and smote once more upon the brazen doors, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat. And Morgoth came. That was the last time in those wars that he passed the doors of his stronghold, and it is said that he took not the challenge willingly, for alone of the Valar he knew fear. But he could not now deny the challenge before the face of his captains, for Fingolfin named Morgoth Craven. Therefore Morgoth issued forth, clad in black armor, and he stood before the king like a tower, iron-crowned, and his vast shield, sable unblazoned, cast a shadow over him like a storm cloud. But Fingolfin gleamed beneath it as a star, for his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword Ringil, that glittered like ice. Then Morgoth hurled aloft Grond, the hammer of the underworld, and swung it down like a bolt of thunder. But Fingolfin sprang aside,
and Grond rent a mighty pit in the earth. Many times Morgoth essayed to smite him, and each time Fingolfin leaped away, and he wounded Morgoth with 7 wounds, and 7 times Morgoth gave a cry of anguish, whereat the hosts of Angband fell upon their faces in dismay, and the cries echoed in the Northlands. But at last the king grew weary, and Morgoth bore down his shield upon him. Thrice he was crushed to his knees, and thrice rose again, and bore up his broken shield and stricken helm. But the earth was all pitted around him, and he stumbled and fell backward before the feet of Morgoth. And Morgoth set his left foot upon his neck, yet with his last and desperate stroke, Fingolfin hewed the foot with Ringil, and the blood gushed forth, black and smoking, and filled the pits of Grond. As he wounds the Dark Lord, Fingolfin dies. While he's victorious, Morgoth would not escape this battle unscathed. As he breaks the body of Fingolfin, he intends to feed it to his wolves. However, in that moment, Thorondor, the Lord of the Great Eagles, flies in and claws the face of Morgoth. He takes the body of Fingolfin and sets it upon a mountaintop, overlooking the hidden city of Gondolin. King Turgon learns of his father's deeds from the Great Eagle and builds a cairn over Fingolfin. Morgoth is scarred from Thorondor's attack and forever bears a limp from the wound of Fingolfin's blade. 10 years later, in 466, 2 others would come to Angband, Beren and Luthien. When Beren, a man, and Luthien, an elf, wish to be married, Luthien's father, King Thingol of Doriath, declares that Beren may only have his daughter's hand if Beren succeeds in reclaiming a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. Beren embarks on a mission to do just that, and after being rescued from the dungeons of Sauron in Tolden Gawroth by Luthien and Huon the Hound, the 3 make their way to Angband, disguised by the power of Luthien. They enter the very throne room of Morgoth, and as the Dark Lord is about to order them seized, Luthien weaves a spell and begins to dance. The spell puts Morgoth and his entire court into a deep sleep. Beren approaches Morgoth. Using his knife, he cuts a Silmaril from the Iron Crown. He decides to retrieve all 3 Silmarils, but as he is cutting a second loose, the knife breaks and a shard strikes Morgoth in the face. As the court begins to stir, Beren and Luthien flee for their lives. Now, I'll be covering the life of Beren and Luthien in next week's video, but this particular Silmaril is never brought back to Morgoth, though it would cause further conflict with the Dark Lord and within the forces of his enemies. It is upon hearing the deeds of Beren and Luthien that 2 alone could successfully retrieve a Silmaril from Angband that moves Mithras in 468 to create an alliance to attack Morgoth. In 469, Morgoth sends forth a wind from Angband. It comes to the lands that border Anfauglith, in particular the lands to the west, like Dorlomin. This plague, known as the Evil Breath, particularly affects the young, and many die from it, including Lalaith, the 3-year-old daughter of Hurin, the Lord of Dorlomin. The men of Dorlomin would join many others in the Union of Mithras, and in 472, fight in what would be one of the most important conflicts of the First Age, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. The Union of Mithras consists of 2 armies, one in the west, one in the east. In the west, Fingon leads the Noldor of Hithlum, Hurin and Huor lead the Edain of Dorlomin, Haldir, the man, not the elf of the Third Age, leads the Edain of Brethil, Gwyndor leads the elves of Nargothrond, and there were also a few scattered elves from Falas and Doriath, including Mablung and Beleg Strongbow. In the east, Mithras commands his elven host. They are joined by Azagal and the dwarves of Belegost. They also had 2 groups of men with them, who had recently relocated to Beleriand after the Dagor Bragalach. These men, known as Easterlings, are under the command of their leaders Bor and Uldor. The plan is simple. The forces of the east would march to Anfauglith. Their hope is that Morgoth would respond by sending his armies to meet them. The western host would remain hidden in the woods and valleys east of the arid Wethrin. There they would await a signal. The great beacon in Dorthonion would fire, at which point the western host would charge, and they would crush the forces of Morgoth, as if caught between hammer and anvil. As Mithras leads his force to Anfauglith, A dark cloud gathers around Thangorodrim. Morgoth has accepted the challenge. As the western host waits, they are joined unexpectedly by a host of 10,000 elves, led by Turgon, brother of Fingon and king of the hidden city of Gondolin. Their might greatly increased, the outlook is promising for the union of Maethros. However, in that very hour, Morgoth implements his plan. A great host issues from Angband to meet Maethros, but at the same time, a smaller host is sent west with the task of provoking the western army. Fingon orders his troops to hold until the orcs attempt to attack the hills on which they stand. At this point, the orcs bring forth Gelmir, the brother of Gwyndor. Having been already blinded, his arms and legs are hewn from his body. Filled with rage, Gwyndor and his soldiers charge at the orcs. Fingon's force follows, and they quickly defeat the smaller host and strike upon the very gates of Angband. In this moment, Morgoth once again knows fear, shaking upon his throne as Gwyndor's elves pound on the gates and kill his guards. However, the Dark Lord's trap was now sprung. Thousands of orcs erupt from hidden tunnels and gates around Angband, killing the entire force, with the exception of Gwyndor, who is captured. Fingon's host is driven back from the walls. Turgon, who had held back from the reckless charge of Gwyndor, drives into the orc host and breaks their lines, meeting with the host of Fingon. Finally, Maethros arrives at what is now the main concentration of the battle. However, before he can join with Fingon and Turgon, Morgoth unleashes the last of his strength. All of Angband is emptied as wolves, balrogs, and dragons join the fray. Though daunting, it is said in this moment the battle could still have been won, but for Morgoth's secret weapon. Uldor and his group of Easterlings turn against Maethros. While the Easterlings under Bor would remain faithful to the elves, the damage has been done. With assault coming from three sides, the eastern host is scattered. The valiant dwarves of Belegost hold off Glaurung, allowing the sons of Feanor to escape into Osiriand. As the dwarves in their iron masks fight the dragon and his fire, Azaghal is trampled by Glaurung. The dying king stabs the dragon in the stomach with a dagger, and Glaurung and many others flee. The western host fared no better. Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, makes his way to Fingon and kills him in single combat. Seeing the battle is lost, Hurin begs Turgon to retreat back to Gondolin. With Fingon dead, he knows Turgon is the last of the House of Fingolfin. If the land of Gondolin can remain hidden, and the son of Fingon who had maimed him survived, Morgoth would still know fear. Hurin and Huor and the men of Dorlomin form a living wall across the fen of Serek, giving time for Turgon to escape with what remains of the elves of Gondolin, and those who followed his brother. Nearly every single man is killed. Huor is killed when shot in the eye with an arrow, and Hurin fights to the very last. As Morgoth had been ordered for him to be taken alive, Hurin continues fighting until his axe withers away. In total, he kills at least 70 orcs and trolls before being pinned under their corpses. The orcs make a pile of bodies on the plains of Anfauglith, of the men and elves that were killed. The mound was so large it could be seen from a great distance. Thereafter, grass grew on that hill alone in all the desolation of Anfauglith, and it is known as the Haud en Nirnaeth, the Hill of Tears. The Nirnaeth Arnoediad is a devastating loss for the elves, men, and dwarves of Middle-earth. In the years and decades to come, it will often be referred to with great sadness and acknowledging this as the moment when Morgoth assumed his control over the entire north of Beleriand. Soon he will press his advantage even further, but first he will lay a curse upon his prized captive, Hurin, that will shape the world for years to come. In the aftermath of the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, a massive victory for the Dark Lord, the northern lands of the elves and men are now under Morgoth's control. Turgon, now High King of the Noldor, and his hidden city of Gondolin stand as the only reason for Morgoth to doubt his odds for total conquest. In the aftermath of the Nirnaeth, Morgoth takes his captive Hurin to a seat in the high places of Thangorodrim, and pronounces a curse upon him and his family.
I am the Elder King, Melkor, first and mightiest of the Valar, who was before the world and made it. The shadow of my purpose lies upon Arda, and all that is in it bends slowly and surely to my will. But upon all whom you love, my thought weighs a cloud of doom, and it shall bring them down into darkness and despair. Wherever they go, evil shall arise. Whenever they speak, their words shall bring ill counsel. Whatsoever they do shall turn against them. They shall die without hope, cursing both life and death.
This last I say to you, Thrall Morgoth, said Hurin, and it comes not from the lore of the Eldar, but is put into my heart this hour. You are not the Lord of men, and shall not be. Though all Arda and Menel fall in your dominion, beyond the circles of the world you shall not pursue those who refuse you.
Beyond the circles of the world I will not pursue them,
said Morgoth.
For beyond the circles of the world there is nothing, but within them they shall not escape me until they enter into nothing.
You lie, said Hurin.
You shall see, and you shall confess that I do not lie,
said Morgoth, and taking Hurin back to Angband, he set him in a chair of stone upon a high place of Thangorodrim, from which he could see afar the land of Hithlum in the west, and the lands of Beleriand in the south. There he was bound by the power of Morgoth, and Morgoth standing beside him cursed him again, and set his power upon him, so that he could not move from that place, or die, until Morgoth should release him.
Sit now there,
said Morgoth,
and look out upon the lands where evil and despair shall come upon those whom you have delivered to me. For you have dared to mock me, and have questioned the power of Melkor, master of the fates of Arda. Therefore with my eyes you shall see, and with my ears you shall hear, and nothing shall be hidden from you.
As I mentioned earlier, Morgoth now has complete dominion over the north of Beleriand. He gives to the Easterlings that served him the lands of Hithlum, denying them the more fertile lands to the south which he had promised them. Many of the elves and men that had remained in Hithlum are sent as thralls to work the mines of Angband. In 473, a year after the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, Morgoth's forces attack and destroy the havens of Falas. Círdan and his people flee to the mouth of Sirion. In the coming years, Morgoth's forces would continue to overthrow realms of men and elves, though Turin, son of Hurin, and Beleg Strongbow in particular would cause much trouble to his orcs. In 489, his orcs defeat the pair when they sack their hideout at Amon Rûth. We'll go into much greater detail on Turin's life in his own video, but we'll mention a couple things as they pertain to Morgoth and his campaign against the realms that remain standing. Through a tragic accident, Turin kills Beleg, mistaking him for an orc. Turin then comes to Nargothrond, where he becomes an advisor to King Orodreth. At Turin's behest, Orodreth ignores the advice of the Vala Ulmo, saying to destroy the bridge and fortify the city. Instead, Turin opts for open war with the armies of Angband. Morgoth sends out Glaurung the dragon once again with a force of orcs. They defeat the army of Nargothrond and sack the city. 10 years later, in 499, after a life of deeds gone awry by the curse of Morgoth, Turin kills himself upon his own sword. This victory would come at a great cost to the Dark Lord, however, as Turin had first killed the dragon Glaurung at Kabed and Arras, not far from the crossing of Teglin. After the death of Turin and his sister Nienor, Morgoth releases Hurin, but the curse would yet follow him. Hurin travels about Beleriand searching for his kin, eventually discovering his wife at the graves of his children. His wife dies, and after burying her, Hurin comes to Nargothrond, where he discovers the Nauglamir, a great necklace made by the dwarves. He takes it to Doriath, where, in his anger that Thingol had not better cared for his son, he throws it down in front of the king.
This would be yet another example of the evil and shadow of Morgoth having a far reach, as his curse would result in yet another realm's downfall. Thingol takes the Nauglamir and tasks a group of dwarves with setting the Silmaril of Beren and Luthien within the necklace. The dwarves come to covet their creation and kill Thingol, leading to the sack of Menegroth in 503. Just a few years later, the Oath of Feanor would rear its ugly head again, as the Sons of Feanor, driven by their oath, take part in the Second Kinslaying in an effort to reclaim the Silmaril from their fellow elves. This would result in the Kingdom of Doriath being completely destroyed, and yet another of Morgoth's enemies is removed. The Silmaril, however, would evade both the Sons of Feanor and Morgoth. Elwing, the daughter of King Dior, is among those who escaped to the havens of Sirion when she is just 4 years old. Meanwhile, in the north of Beleriand stood the one last bastion of hope for the free peoples, Gondolin. Outside of the hidden city, Meglin, one of the elves of Gondolin, is captured by orcs and brought to Angband. Morgoth promises Meglin the kingship of Gondolin and the hand of Idril, the woman he loves. All he must do is reveal the secret location of the city. In the greatest betrayal of the First Age, Meglin agrees, and Morgoth finally has the information he has long sought. In 510, as the Gondolodrim are celebrating the festival of the Gates of Summer, they gather to watch the sunrise over the mountains. However, rather than seeing light arise in the east, they see light in the north. The armies of Morgoth, orcs, wolves, dragons, balrogs, and other creatures descend upon the city. While Gothmog would fall in battle, it is an overwhelming victory for the Dark Lord. King Turgon, the Lord Ecthelion, Glorfindel, and the vast majority of the population are killed in the battle. Gondolin, the last hope of the elves, is no more. One of the very few survivors is the 7-year-old elf Erendil, who, along with the others, would make his way south to the havens of Sirion. There, he would meet Elwing. Decades later, they would be married and have twin sons, Elrond and Elros. 6 years later, the Sons of Feanor would once again be led by their oath to slay their own kin. In the third kinslaying, Elwing escapes with the Silmaril and is taken on her husband's ship as they sail to the west, in a stroke that would change the fortunes of the world. They come to Valinor, and Erendil pleads with the Valar, and Erendil went into Valinor and to the halls of Valimar, and never again set foot upon the lands of men. Then the Valar took counsel together, and they summoned Ulmo from the depths of the sea, and Erendil stood before their faces and delivered the errand of the two kindreds. Pardon he asked for the Noldor, and pity for their great sorrows, and mercy upon men and elves, and succor in their need. And his prayer was granted. The Valar send forth a great host of Valinor, which lands in Beleriand in 545. Included in the host are the Vanyar, led by Ingwion, the Noldor of Valinor under Finarfin, Eonwe, the chief of the Maiar, and possibly other Maiar, and even some Valar. It is said that the whole power of the throne of Morgoth is assembled. The armies of Morgoth are uncountable. The mountains rang underneath the boots of the Valar. The entire north of Beleriand is aflame with war for 42 years. In the final years of the battle, Morgoth is facing defeat. In his final act of desperation, he summons the Winged Dragons, never before seen in Middle-earth. The dragons are led by Ancalagon the Black, the largest and most powerful dragon to ever live. The tide turned, the host of Valinor is driven back, and their outlook is bleak, as so many of the battles that had come before against the Dark Lord. It is in this moment when Erendil, wearing the Silmaril upon his brow, arrives in his ship. The ship, having been blessed by the Valar, sails not the seas, but the skies. With Erendil is Thorondor and flocks of the great eagles. Together they battle the dragons for an entire day. In the end, Erendil kills Ancalagon, who breaks the towers of Thangorodrim in his ruin. As the host of Valinor retakes the battlefield and defeats his army force by force, Morgoth flees to the deepest dungeons of Angband. There he is caught, but being weak from the war, he demands peace and parley rather than fight. But his feet are hewn from under him, Morgoth falls upon the floor where he is bound once again in the chain of Aule. The 2 Silmarils are taken from him, and he is thrust through the Door of Night and into the timeless void. While Morgoth is removed from Beleriand, his effects are far from gone. As a result of the battle, most of Beleriand is destroyed. The wreckage of the war is so great that soon after, all of the lands west of the arid Luin, along with a central portion of the Blue Mountains, sink into the sea. Many of the elves make the journey back to Aman, while some, such as Galadriel, Gil-galad, Círdan, and Elrond, travel east. There, in the ages to come, they would face a new Dark Lord, Sauron, the lieutenant of Morgoth, who had fled to the east. As for the original Dark Lord, he would not be heard from again in recorded history. However, it is prophesied that Morgoth will one day break the Door of Night, and there shall be one final battle, the Dagor Dagorath, the battle of all battles, a final confrontation between good and evil on the very plains of Valinor. Tolkien wrote many versions regarding the Dagor Dagorath, leaving some details up for debate and speculation, including the idea that it would be Turin who would deal the final blow, killing Morgoth himself and avenging the children of Húrin. In the end, the lands of Beleriand will be lifted up from the sea and the world rebuilt, with the dwarves helping their creator Aule in doing so. The dwarves will then be counted among the children of Iluvatar, and then shall take place the second song of the Ainur, this time with the children of Iluvatar joining in the music, ushering in a new world. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.
Vengeance is a cruel mistress. Unleash our wrath. Our voices speak as one.
Today's video is brought to you by Slide Belts, creators of high-quality belts featuring unique ratcheting buckles. Not only do they make my personal favorite belt, the Survival Belt, but they're also longtime viewers of the channel. I've personally used Slide Belts for some time now, and honestly, they make a fantastic product. It also makes a great gift since you can buy one size and trim it to fit. Be sure to stick around to the end of the video for a special discount code for my viewers, redeemable at slidebelts.com. He is the heir of Isildur, chieftain of the Dunedain, and destined to reunite the great kingdoms of men. After a traumatic childhood, decades of wilderness and war, and finally reclaiming the throne, he would go on to serve his realm in his second century of life. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the complete travels of Aragorn. Aragorn II is born on March 1st, 2931 of the Third Age, to his father Arathorn II and mother Gilrain. Gilrain's mother, Evorwen, had convinced her husband to allow the marriage despite his objections. With her gift of foresight, she had proclaimed that from their marriage, hope might be born for the Dunedain, and that their son would one day wear a green stone upon his breast. When Aragorn is just 2 years old, his father is killed, shot in the eye by an orc arrow. Gilrain takes her son to Rivendell to be fostered by Elrond. Over the years, this had become a custom for the heirs of Isildur to be fostered in Rivendell for a time. With his father slain, Elrond would care for Aragorn as if he were his own son. For the child's safety, Elrond would keep his identity a secret, instead calling him Estelle, the Sindarin word for hope. In his early years, Estelle would often go on journeys with Elrond's twin sons, Elladan and Elrohir. The twins had also, years earlier, been on the hunt with Arathorn when he was killed. In 2952, when Estelle is around 20 years old, he returns to Rivendell from a journey of great deeds with Elladan and Elrohir. Elrond is pleased to see that Estelle has grown to be both fair and noble, and that he was coming to manhood early. Thus, Elrond reveals to Estelle his true name, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur. Elrond presents to him the heirlooms of the Dunedain of the North, the shards of Narsil, and the ring of Barahir. There is one final heirloom, the Scepter of Annúminas, the original capital of the northern kingdom of Arnor, established by Elendil himself. Elrond withholds the scepter from Aragorn, saying he must first earn it. The following day, Aragorn is walking alone in the woods at sunset. His heart is full of hope, and he begins to sing the Lay of Luthien, the very song Aragorn sings in the Fellowship of the Ring film. As he wanders in the woods, he comes across an elf maiden, and to Aragorn she seems as Luthien herself, widely known to be the most beautiful person to have ever lived. Fearing that she would leave, and he would never see her again, he calls to her, Tinuviel, Tinuviel, just as Beren had done when he first met Luthien. The elf corrects him, for she is not Luthien reborn, but Arwen, daughter of Elrond. She had just returned from a long visit in Lorien with her grandparents, Galadriel and Celeborn. Aragorn, who had just learned of his high lineage, feels as though it is nothing compared to her dignity and loveliness. We are told that Gilrain opposes the idea of Aragorn and Arwen being together, for she believes Arwen's lineage is more noble, and that elves and men should not intermarry. Ironically, both Aragorn and Arwen are descended from two such unions, Beren and Luthien, and Tuor and Idril. Likewise, Elrond would learn of Aragorn's love for his daughter, not from Gilrain or from Arwen, but he says he can see the truth in Aragorn's eyes. He summons Aragorn and tells him, "A great doom awaits you, either to rise above the height of all your fathers since the days of Elendil, or to fall into darkness with all that is left of your kin. Many years of trial lie before you. You shall neither have wife, nor bind any woman to you in troth, until your time comes, and you are found worthy of it." Elrond says the future will bring what it may, and that they will not speak of this topic for many years, and that days of darkness lie ahead. Aragorn lovingly takes his leave of Elrond. He bids farewell to his mother, the House of Elrond, and to Arwen, and goes into the wild. Aragorn takes up his mantle as 16th Chieftain of the Dunedain, and in 2956 of the Third Age, meets Gandalf the Grey for the first time. The two would go on to become great friends. It is Gandalf who advises Aragorn to keep watch over the region of the Shire, where he would become known as Strider. From 2957 to 2980, Aragorn goes on many great journeys, aiding the Men of the West against Sauron. So as not to reveal his identity, he goes by the name of Thorongil, a name Gondorians called him, meaning Eagle of the Star, for he wore a silver star upon his cloak and was known for being keen-eyed. He would first come to Rohan, where he would serve under King Thengel, the father of Theoden. Thorongil would ride with the Rohirrim for some time, until hearing a summons from Gondor, requesting aid of any men who are willing. He travels to Minas Tirith, coming to serve the steward Ecthelion II, father of Denethor. Thorongil's arrival, and his deeds on both land and sea, would cause a rift with Denethor, for it is said that Ecthelion trusted and loved Thorongil most. Among Thorongil's counsels to the steward is that he should not trust the wizard Saruman, but instead Gandalf the Grey. This was in opposition to Denethor, who did not trust Mithrandir. Not only was it so with his father, but Denethor also finds himself placed second to Thorongil in the hearts of the men of Gondor as well, bringing about a resentment that would last for decades to come. While Thorongil is known for great deeds and leadership during his time in Gondor, we are only told of one particular battle in 2980. his last in Gondor for many long years. Ecthelion had been anticipating an attack from Sauron, for it had been nearly 30 years since Sauron had declared himself openly once again in Mordor, and it was only a matter of time until he moved against his closest neighbor. Thorongil counsels the steward, saying the corsairs of Umbar would wreak havoc upon the southern fiefs should Sauron move against them. Ecthelion gives Thorongil leave to take some Gondorian vessels south in an attempt to deal with this great threat. Thorongil leads the navy to the Gulf of Umbar, catching the corsairs by surprise. They burn and destroy many corsair ships, and Thorongil himself kills the captain of the Haven of Umbar in battle. He then withdraws his forces, having suffered only a few losses. Thanks to this attack, the threat of Umbar would be diminished for several years, protecting Gondor from naval attack. Though he would be honored greatly for his deeds should he return to Gondor, Thorongil leaves his men when they stop at Pelargir. He sends word to Ecthelion that other tasks now called to him. The last his men would see of Thorongil is him heading toward the Mountains of Shadow. The men of Gondor feel a great loss at the departure of Thorongil, all save Denethor. As Denethor would soon ascend to the role of steward, Aragorn spends the following years traveling to distant lands, as we are told in the Lord of the Rings appendices. And then in the hour of victory, he passed out of the knowledge of men of the West, and went alone far into the east and deep into the south, exploring the hearts of men, both evil and good, and uncovering the plots and devices of the servants of Sauron. It is said that his work in these years would help ensure the survival of the West decades later during the War of the Ring. Finally, in mid-2980, Aragorn makes his way home toward Rivendell. En route, he stops for a time in Lorien, where Galadriel tells him to cast aside his way-worn raiment, giving him clothes of silver and white. Aragorn now appears to be more than any kind of men, but rather an elf lord from the Isles of the West. Unbeknownst to Aragorn, Arwen is once again visiting her grandparents at this same time. The now 49-year-old mortal man once again meets the one whom he loves. They would walk together for a time in the glades of Lothlorien, until it is time for Aragorn to depart. They come to the hill of Caden Emroth, where they look east to the shadow and west to the twilight. And Arwen said, "Dark is the shadow, and yet my heart rejoices, for you, Estelle, shall be among the great whose valor will destroy it." But Aragorn answered, "Alas, I cannot foresee it, and how it may come to pass is hidden from me. Yet with your hope, I will hope, and the shadow I utterly reject. But neither, lady, is the twilight for me, for I am mortal, and if you will cleave to me, Evenstar, then the twilight you must also renounce." And she stood then as still as a white tree, looking into the west, and at last she said, "I will cleave to you, Dunedain, and turn from the twilight." Together they plight their troth, and Aragorn gives to Arwen the ring of Barahir as a ring of betrothal. Aragorn returns to Rivendell, where Elrond has learned of his daughter's choice. When Elrond learned the choice of his daughter, he was silent, though his heart was grieved, and found the doom long feared none the easier to endure. And when Aragorn came to Rivendell, he called him to him, and he said, "My son, years come when hope will fade, and beyond them little is clear to me, and now a shadow lies between us. Maybe it has been appointed so, that by my loss the kingship of men may be restored. Therefore, though I love you, I say to you, Arwen Undomiel shall not diminish her life's grace for less cause. She shall not be the bride of any man less than the king of both Gondor and Arnor. To me then, even our victory can bring only sorrow and parting, but to you hope of joy for a while. Alas, my son, I fear that to Arwen the doom of men may seem hard at the ending." So it stood afterwards between Elrond and Aragorn, and they spoke no more of this matter. But Aragorn went forth again into danger and toil, And while the world darkened and fear fell on Middle-earth, as the power of Sauron grew and Barad-dûr rose ever taller and stronger, Arwen remained in Rivendell. And when Aragorn was abroad, from afar she watched over him in thought. And in hope she made for him a great and kingly standard, such as only one might display who claimed the lordship of the Númenóreans and the inheritance of Elendil. Just over 20 years later, in 3001 of the Third Age, as Sauron continues to regain his power in Mordor, Aragorn takes on a new task, assisting Gandalf in searching for news of the creature Gollum. This is the very year of Bilbo's 111th birthday, and Gandalf has come to suspect that what is now Frodo's ring may in fact be the one. 6 years later, in 3007, Aragorn returns briefly to Eriador, where he visits his mother for the last time. She tells him that it will be their last parting, saying that she cannot face the darkness that gathers upon Middle-earth, for she will leave it soon. Aragorn attempts to comfort his mother, saying there may yet be light beyond the darkness. In her final words to her son, Gilrain says, Onen I estel edain, ukebin estel anim, meaning, I gave hope to the Dunedain. I have kept no hope for myself. Notice the first instance of Estel is capitalized here. She did not simply give hope to the descendants of Númenor, she gave her son. And in one of my favorite deep cut moments of the films, Elrond and Aragorn recite these very words, a reference to Gilrain, the mother of Aragorn, who died seeing only the darkness that lied upon the path her son must trod. After searching intermittently for many years, Aragorn finally overtakes Gollum in the Dead Marshes in 3017. He goes north through the Emyn Muil in an effort to avoid detection by Sauron's spies. He then crosses the great river Anduin at Sarn-Gebir by tying Gollum to a log and swimming across the river. They proceed along the edges of Fangorn Forest and through Lothlorien. Upon their arrival, the Elves of Lorien send word to Gandalf of Gollum's capture. But Aragorn's journey is not yet complete. He and Gollum proceed along the Anduin northward, and with the help of the Beornings, they enter Mirkwood, finally coming to Thranduil's halls. He turns Gollum over to the Elven King to be held captive for Gandalf's interrogation. In total, Aragorn had traveled some 900 miles on foot with Gollum in tow. After this long journey, Aragorn returns to Eriador and his Dunedain. He would next meet Gandalf at Sarn Ford in May 3018. There, Gandalf tells Aragorn of his plan for Frodo to leave the Shire bearing the ring in late September. As summer wanes and September finally comes, Aragorn learns from the elves of Gildor that Gandalf has gone missing, and the Nazgul have been seen. He also learns that Frodo has left Hobbiton, but there is no news of him leaving Buckland. Aragorn anxiously watches over the East Road with his rangers, looking for signs of the Ringbearer. Finally, on September 29th, 4 halflings enter the Prancing Pony in Bree, as the ranger Strider sits in the corner. After Frodo stands on a table and sings a song in an effort to prevent Pippin from revealing the story of Bilbo's disappearance, the hobbit falls and vanishes before everyone's eyes. Strider confronts Frodo about the foolishness of his actions and would meet the hobbits in their room that night. He warns them of the danger of the Black Riders, tells them that he is a friend of Gandalf, and shows them the hilt shard of Narsil, the blade that was broken. As Barlam and Butterbur delivers a letter from Gandalf he had forgotten to send to Frodo 3 months earlier, which supports Strider's claims, the ranger requests only that Frodo accept him as his guide to Rivendell. This results in one of the funniest exchanges in all of The Lord of the Rings. "Well, you know your own business, maybe," said Butterbur, looking suspiciously at Strider. "But if I was in your plight, I wouldn't take up with a ranger." "Then who would you take up with?" asked Strider. "A fat innkeeper who only remembers his own name because people shouted at him all day?" Frodo agrees to take Strider on as their guide. They head east from Bree, passing through Chetwood, the Midgewater Marshes, and the Weather Hills, arriving at Weathertop on October 6, 3018. There they find a stone with strange markings. Aragorn deduces that it is the G rune with 3 strokes, interpreting this to mean that Gandalf was present on Weathertop on October 3rd. That evening, they would come under attack by 5 of the Nazgul. The other 4 had gone in pursuit of Gandalf after their encounter at this very spot 3 nights before. After Frodo is stabbed, Aragorn drives the Nazgul away, brandishing a flaming brand of wood in either hand. Aragorn does what he can for the wounded hobbit, treating him with Ethelas, after singing a slow song in Sindarin over the dagger hilt of the Nazgul. Aragorn continues to lead the hobbits toward Rivendell for the next 12 days. They encounter the 3 trolls from Bilbo's adventure before they come across the elf lord Glorfindel on the evening of October 18th. As they continue their journey, they are waylaid by the Nazgul on October 20th. Glorfindel sends Frodo forth on his horse Asphaloth, while he, Aragorn, and the other hobbits come behind bearing torches, driving the Nazgul into the river Bruinen. With Frodo on the other side, the river rises against the servants of the enemy, who are swept away. Their steeds killed, they are left to return to Mordor on foot. Aragorn would then bring Frodo to Rivendell, where he is healed of his Morgul wound by Elrond. 5 days later, Aragorn would attend the Council of Elrond, where he is revealed to be the heir of Elendil to the wider group. When Boromir looks upon Aragorn with doubt, Bilbo is annoyed on his friend's behalf. Suddenly standing, he bursts out, "All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king." Not very good perhaps, but to the point. If you need more beyond the word of Elrond, if that was worth a journey of 110 days to hear, you had best listen to it. He sat down with a snort. And indeed, the blade that was broken would be reforged there in Rivendell. Aragorn renames it Andúril, the Flame of the West. Later, Elrond would reveal to Frodo that Aragorn was to be part of his company departing Rivendell. The original intent was that Aragorn and Boromir would travel with the Fellowship while their paths were the same, and that the 2 men would return to Gondor to assist the Kingdom of Men. Aragorn and Gandalf would spend much time together in Rivendell, speaking of their road and analyzing maps and books of lore in the House of Elrond. The Fellowship departs on December 25th, 3018, making their way south, where they must choose among 3 paths: the Redhorn Pass over the Misty Mountains, the Lost Kingdom of Moria beneath the mountains, or the Gap of Rohan. With Saruman's treachery, the Gap of Rohan is not safe, and Aragorn encourages the group to take the Redhorn Pass. They would encounter heavy blizzards and be forced to turn back in defeat on January 12th, 3019. When the option of Moria comes up once more, Aragorn notes that he had once passed through that dark realm on his own. "I too once passed the Dimril Gate," said Aragorn quietly, "but though I also came out again, the memory is very evil. I do not wish to enter Moria a second time." In one last effort to dissuade Gandalf, he says, "You followed my lead almost to disaster in the snow, and have said no word of blame. I will follow your lead now, if this last warning does not move you. It is not of the ring nor of us others that I am thinking now, but of you, Gandalf. And I say to you, if you pass the doors of Moria, beware." Eventually, Aragorn and the rest of the company would relent to Gandalf's will to pass through Khazad-dûm, after they are attacked by wolves in the early hours of January 13th. After 2 days of traveling the Dark Realm, Gandalf falls in his face-off with the Balrog upon the bridge of Khazad-dûm. After the company flees the mountain and weeps for the loss of Gandalf, Aragorn would lead them onward. "Alas, I feel we cannot stay here longer," said Aragorn. He looked toward the mountains and held up his sword. "Farewell, Gandalf," he cried. "Did I not say to you, if you pass the doors of Moria, beware?
Alas that I spoke true. What hope have we without you?
He turned to the company.
We must do without hope, he
The
said.
item is complete.
At least we may yet be avenged. Let us gird ourselves and weep no more. Come, we have a long road and much to do.
Aragorn leads the fellowship to Lothlorien, where they would eventually come to Caras Galadhon and meet Celeborn and Galadriel. The rest of the company is amazed at Aragorn's friendship with the elves of this incredible realm. They would remain in Lorien for 1 month, leaving on February 16, 3019. Before their departure, Galadriel would bestow gifts upon the fellowship. To Aragorn, she gives the Elfstone, serving as a wedding gift from the bride's family to the groom. This green gem would be worn by Aragorn ever after, fulfilling the prediction of his grandmother so many years ago. And indeed, Aragorn would take his royal name of Elisar from this very gem. For a week, the Fellowship travels by boat down the Anduin River, surviving a brief attack on February 23rd, before passing the Argonath, the Great Pillars of the Kings, on February 25th.
Fear not,
said a strange voice behind him. Frodo turned and saw Strider, and yet not Strider, for the weather-worn ranger was no longer there. In the stern sat Aragorn, son of Arathorn, proud and erect, guiding the boat with skillful strokes. His hood was cast back, and his dark hair was blowing in the wind. A light was in his eyes, a king, returning from exile to his own land.
fear not, he said. Long have I desired to look upon the likenesses of Isildur and Anarion, my sires of old. Under their shadow, Elisar, the Elfstone son of Arathorn of the House of Valandil, Isildur's son, heir of Elendil, has naught to dread.
Despite his majestic appearance in Frodo's eyes, there is still great doubt in Aragorn's mind. While he wishes to go with Boromir to Minas Tirith, he now feels that with Gandalf fallen, he should accompany the Ring-Bearer wherever he should go. The following day, the company is attacked by orcs at Amon Hen. In the tumult, the 4 hobbits are lost, and Aragorn finds a mortally wounded Boromir, pierced with many arrows. Boromir tells Aragorn that the orcs took the halflings captive, and says,
Farewell, Aragorn. Go to Minas Tirith and save my people. I have failed.
No, said Aragorn, taking his hand and kissing his brow. You have conquered. Few have gained such a victory. Be at peace. Minas Tirith shall not fall. Boromir smiled. Which way did they go? Was Frodo there? Said Aragorn. But Boromir did not speak again.
Alas, said Aragorn, thus passes the heir of Denethor, Lord of the Tower of God. This is a bitter end. Now the company is all in ruin. It is I that have failed. Vain was Gandalf's trust in me. What shall I do now? Boromir has laid it on me to go to Minas Tirith, and my heart desires it. But where are the ring and the bearer? How shall I find them and save this quest from disaster? Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli place Boromir in one of the elven boats, his broken horn and sword across his lap, and the weapons of his vanquished foes at his feet. Singing a lament for Boromir, they set his funeral boat adrift in the Anduin, which would carry his body over the falls of Rauros and far beyond. Aragorn is able to discern that not only was Frodo not a captive of the orcs, but that he had taken the other elven boat across the river along with Sam. Finally, resolved in his decision, he, Gimli, and Legolas, the 3 hunters, speed through the trees, tireless and swift. Pursuing the orcs, they pass away, gray shadows in a stony land. The 3 hunters make their way across the western portion of Rohan, following the orcs toward Fangorn Forest. Just over 3 days after leaving Amon Hen, they encounter Eomer on February 30th. Eomer is amazed to find they had traveled 45 leagues in just 3 days. Aragorn and Eomer form an easy friendship, each sensing the honesty and lordliness in the other. Rather than taking the intruders of Rohan captive, Eomer gives them horses, with Aragorn promising to return to Edoras.
Aragorn would go on in an attempt to track the footsteps of Merry and Pippin, coming to